autumn air nipped at my face as I hiked through the towering pines of the Nicolet National Forest in northern Wisconsin. Golden leaves crunched under my boots with each step. I had been a park ranger for over a decade now, serving in parks and forests across the country, from the hardwood forests of Pennsylvania to the temperate rainforests of Oregon. But something about these deep northern woods always unsettled me. "You doing okay there, Jake?" asked my fellow ranger Mike, glancing over his shoulder at me. "You seem a bit on edge." I forced a smile. "Yeah, I'm all right. Just, this forest gives me the creeps sometimes, you know? All the stories and rumors." Mike chuckled. "What, you don't actually believe those old native legends, do you? About the bizarre creatures that supposedly lurk in these woods?" I shrugged. "I don't know what to believe anymore. After all my years as a ranger, I've seen and heard some strange things out there that I can't quite explain." We continued hiking in silence for a while. The sun began to set, bathing the forest in an eerie orange glow. Shadows lengthened, and an owl hooted mournfully in the distance. I was about to suggest we turn back and head to the ranger station when Mike froze. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I stood completely still, straining my ears. At first, all I could hear was the soft sigh of the wind through the pines, but then from somewhere deep in the forest came a sound that made my blood run cold. A long, agonized wail that sounded almost human, but not quite. It rose in pitch and volume until it became a deafening shriek, then cut off abruptly. Mike and I looked at each other, eyes wide. "What the hell was that?" he said, his voice shaking slightly. Before I could respond, a twig snapped loudly behind us. We both whirled around, pulling out our flashlights. The beams cut through the gathering darkness, illuminating the trees. At first I didn't see anything. Then, about 30 yards away, I caught a glimpse of something. A pale figure darting between the trees, too fast for me to make out clearly. But I could have sworn it moved on all fours. "Mike, look," I shouted, pointing with my flashlight. But as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into the shadows. Mike swallowed hard. "Okay, maybe those tribal elders we talked to weren't just trying to scare us with their stories. You saw that too, right?" I nodded slowly. "Yeah, I did. We need to be careful." We continued cautiously through the darkening forest, jumping at every noise, flashlights sweeping the trees. It was fully night now, with only a sliver of moon peeking through the branches. Suddenly, Mike's radio crackled to life, making us both flinch. "All units, we have a report of a missing hiker. Last seen near your location," dispatch reported. "Please be on the lookout." We exchanged a grim look. Missing hikers were all too common in these remote stretches of wilderness. But with the disturbing things we had just seen and heard, this felt different, more ominous. As if on cue, another blood-curdling wail split the night, closer this time. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there was hunting, and we were the prey. "We need to find that hiker fast," I said, "and then get the hell out of this forest." Mike nodded in agreement, his face pale. Gripping our flashlights with sweaty hands, we forged ahead into the hungry darkness, dreading what we might find, or what might find us. The narrow beams of our flashlights felt pitifully inadequate against the oppressive blackness that closed in around us as we moved deeper into the forest. My heart pounded in my chest and my breaths came fast and ragged. Every rustle of leaves or skittering of some small animal made me jump. "Hello? Is anyone out there?" Mike called out periodically. "This is the Park Service. We're here to help." His voice seemed to be swallowed up by the heavy silence almost as soon as the words left his mouth. A small, paranoid part of my mind wondered if we were doing more harm than good by announcing our presence so loudly and clearly. If this missing hiker had run afoul of something unnatural, would we simply be drawing its attention as well? I shook my head, trying to dispel these dark, irrational thoughts. We were trained professionals. Whatever was going on, we could handle it, but I couldn't quite convince myself. "Jake, over here," Mike said suddenly. "I found something." I hurried over to where he stood at the base of a large oak tree. He pointed his flashlight at the ground. There, illuminated in the stark white LED light, was a hiking boot. It was caked in dried mud and lay on its side as if it had been tossed there carelessly. About 10 feet away was its mate. A scrap of torn, blood-stained fabric that looked like it might have been part of a shirt fluttered from a nearby sapling. My throat tightened with dread. This was looking more and more like a crime scene, not a simple lost hiker case. I pulled out my radio to update dispatch on our grim discovery, but only got a hiss of static. The signal was being blocked by something. "Looks like we're on our own out here," I said grimly, putting the useless radio away. We scanned the area, looking for any other clues, any hint to the hiker's whereabouts or fate, but the forest kept its secrets. As I crouched to examine a patch of flattened, bloody leaves, a soft noise made me freeze. It sounded like footsteps, the slow, furtive steps of something trying to move quietly but not quite succeeding, and it was getting closer. I stood up slowly, gripping my flashlight so tightly my knuckles turned white. Mike moved to stand back to back with me, his breath coming in short, frightened puffs. The footsteps grew louder, twigs cracking, from multiple directions now, surrounding us. "Show yourself," I shouted, hating the quaver in my voice. Silence. The steps had stopped. For a few endless seconds, the only sound was the thundering of blood in my ears. Then the shrieks began. Hideous, inhuman howls tearing through the night from all sides, ringing with a disturbing note of twisted glee, as if delighted by our terror. Through the trees, I caught flashes of pale, lurching forms, vaguely humanoid, but moving with a grotesque, disjointed gait. "Run!" I screamed. "Run!" Blind with panic, we crashed through the underbrush, thorns tearing at our clothes, branches whipping our faces. The shrieks and wails from the horrors behind us grew louder, spurring us on. I risked a glance over my shoulder and instantly regretted it. The things chasing us were clearly visible now, illuminated by our dancing, flickering flashlights. They were human, but not. Their limbs were too long, their faces distorted into leering skull-like masks, their eyes sunk in pits of darkness. And they were fast, far faster than us, gaining ground with each passing second. "We'll never outrun them," Mike gasped out, his voice edged with desperation. "The river," I panted. "Maybe we can lose them at the river." I prayed I was remembering the map of the area correctly, that there was a deep, fast-moving river carving through the forest nearby. We veered left, following the downward slope of the land, legs pumping, chests heaving. The shrieks behind us took on a note of frenzied bloodlust. I could swear I felt cold, grasping fingers brushing the back of my neck. And then, there it was, a ribbon of black, churning water cutting through the trees up ahead. With a final burst of energy born of pure terror, we sprinted toward it. At the bank, we leapt out over the water without hesitation. The shock of the icy water knocked the breath from my lungs as I plunged beneath the surface. The current seized me instantly, tumbling me head over heels. I fought my way back to the surface, gasping and spluttering. A few feet away, I saw Mike's head break the surface as well. Behind us, at the edge of the river, our pursuers milled about, screaming in fury. They paced back and forth but seemed unable or unwilling to enter the water. The river swept us swiftly downstream and around a bend, the horrifying wails fading into the night. Exhausted and battered, we dragged ourselves ashore on a rocky outcropping, a good half-mile from where we had jumped in. For a long time we just lay there, chests heaving, not saying a word. The forest was deathly quiet. Finally, I pushed myself to a sitting position with a groan. What the hell were those things, Jake?" Mike asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "They weren't human. They couldn't have been." I just shook my head, at a loss for words. My mind reeled, trying to process the sheer impossibility of what we had just experienced. "I don't know, Mike," I said finally, "but whatever they are, we're not even close to being equipped to deal with them. We need to get back to the station, regroup, and call for help." He nodded jerkily and started to get to his feet. Then he froze, eyes widening with horror at something over my shoulder. "Jake, behind you." I started to turn, a new fear gripping my heart. The last thing I saw before a stunning blow to the back of my head plunged me into darkness was a looming, emaciated figure with eyes like bottomless pits. Then, nothing. Consciousness returned slowly, in throbbing, pain-soaked fragments. The first thing I became aware of was the cold, damp ground beneath me. Rough stones scraped my cheek. Next was the musty, rotting smell that filled my nostrils, underlaid with a coppery tang that could only be blood. Finally, I registered the dim, flickering light, casting distorted shadows on what seemed to be jagged cavern walls rising up on either side of me. I jerked upright with a gasp. then immediately pressed my hands to my pounding skull. Memories crashed over me. The missing hiker, the pale monstrosities chasing us, leaping into the river. And then, something attacking me from behind. "Mike?" I called out hoarsely, my voice echoing in the enclosed space. "Mike, are you there?" No response. Fighting down rising panic, I struggled to my feet, swaying dangerously until the dizziness passed. In the feeble light of a few guttering torches wedged into crevices in the cavern walls, I tried to get my bearings. I appeared to be in some kind of tunnel, with no immediately evident way out. The rock walls were slick with moisture and crawling with pale worms and beetles. Claw marks gouged into the stone gave the disturbing impression of hundreds of desperate hands scrabbling for purchase. As my eyes adjusted, I saw that the tunnel branched off in several different directions at the far end, each dark maw promising only more fear and disorientation. The one directly ahead of me sloped downwards at a steep angle, descending deeper into the earth. A foul breeze drifted up from it, carrying a stomach-churning stench of decay and a sibilant whisper that might have been the rush of an unseen river, or something else. Steeling myself, I checked my pockets, taking inventory. My flashlight was gone, either lost in the river or taken by whatever brought me here. My radio, compass, and weapon were missing as well. Dread quickly built into full-blown terror as the reality of my situation sank in. I was alone, unarmed, with no way to call for help, in some kind of underground labyrinth populated by unnatural horrors. For a moment, I almost succumbed to the black despair rising up to drown me. What chance did I possibly have of surviving this, much less saving Mike and the lost hiker? Then, from somewhere deep inside, a small ember of determination flared to life. I was a park ranger, damn it. I had dedicated my life to protecting people and the wild places I loved, and I wasn't about to quit now. Dire circumstances be damned. I would find a way out of this nightmare, or die trying. Squaring my shoulders, I began exploring the first side tunnel entrance. Hugging the dank wall, straining my eyes in the murk, the passage twisted and turned, leading me on an aimless, meandering path. Here and there, small chambers branched off but revealed nothing of use, no sign of Mike the hiker or a way out. Occasionally I glimpsed shadowy shapes flitting along the edges of the torchlight, chittering and scurrying just out of sight. I tried not to think about what they might be. After what felt like hours of blind wandering, I stumbled out into a larger cavern. Raising my eyes from my careful study of the uneven ground, I felt my breath catch in my throat. There, stacked against the far wall, were piles of hiking gear, backpacks, boots, coils of rope, dented cookware, and among the jumbled equipment gleamed the unmistakable white of human bones. Bile burned the back of my throat as the scene came into nightmarish focus. Scraps of tattered, stained clothing still clung to some of the skeletons. A sun-bleached backpack had a smiling family photo pinned to it. These were the lost hikers, at least a dozen of them, men, women, even a few that looked child-sized, and from the varying states of decay and the layer of dust coating everything, this dank charnel house had been accumulating its grim trophies for quite some time. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the horrific sight, but the image was seared into my mind. Those skeletons weren't just anonymous remains. Each one represented a real person who had suffered and died in this forsaken place, alone and terrified, just like I would, if I couldn't find a way out. A skittering noise behind me shattered my paralysis. I whirled to see a pale, emaciated figure crouched in the tunnel I had just traversed, watching me with dark, hollow eyes. My gorge rose. The thing had once been human, but starvation and unimaginable cruelties had transformed it into a feral, malformed wretch, more animal than man. "Stay back," I warned, trying to inject some authority into my faltering voice. "I'm with the Park Service. I want to help you." The creature cocked its head to the side, considering. For a moment it almost seemed like a spark of human intelligence flickered in those fathomless eyes. Then it opened its mouth unnaturally wide and let out a gurgling shriek, exposing jagged shards of teeth and a lolling black tongue. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. In a blind panic, I turned and fled down a random tunnel, the creature's wails chasing me into the darkness. My heart pounded in my chest as I ran blindly through the twisting, disorienting tunnels, my ragged breaths tearing at my lungs. Behind me I could hear the scrabbling and howling of the aberrant humanoid creature giving chase, along with other shrieks and chittering, echoing through the caverns, a terrifying cacophony of predatory glee that grew louder with each passing second. I had no idea where I was going, turning corners at random, splashing through icy subterranean streams, stumbling and clawing my way over heaps of rubble and down narrow passages. My hands were scraped raw and bloody from grasping at the rough stone, and I had lost all sense of direction and my primal need to get away. Just as I felt my strength starting to flag, my legs turning to jelly beneath me, I burst out into a larger cavern and skidded to a halt, stunned by what I saw. The chamber was lit by an eerie phosphorescent glow emanating from clumps of pale fungus clinging to the walls and ceiling, and in that unsettling light, I beheld a sight that stopped my heart. In the center of the cavern lay an enormous heap of bones, not the cleanly picked remains I had seen before, but fresher kills, the viscera and sinew still clinging to them, congealing into a gory paste on the damp stone floor. A vile stench of rot hung thick in the air, but most horrifying of all were the figures crouched around this repellent feast, ripping and tearing at the meat, gurgling and growling. At first, my stunned mind tried to convince itself that I was seeing a pack of hyenas or some other scavenging animal, but hyenas didn't have pale, almost translucent skin hanging from the bones, or weirdly elongated limbs that bent at unnatural angles. And they certainly didn't have those horrible distorted faces with gaping mouths and large night-black eyes that gleamed with a sick intelligence as they swiveled to stare at me. Time seemed to freeze as I stood there, my mind trying and failing to process the nightmare tableau before me. The creatures remained motionless as well, in a moment of mutual shocked paralysis. Then, as one, they rose from their grisly meal, bloody claws flexing, lipless mouths peeling back to reveal rows of jagged teeth, and started shambling toward me. Unfrozen into action by pure animal terror, I spun and sprinted for the nearest tunnel opening, just as a cacophony of eager shrieks and howls erupted behind me. I could hear the freakish beings giving chase, their uneven footsteps and excited panting echoing off the narrow cavern walls as I fled in blind panic. I ran until my lungs seared and my muscles screamed in protest, taking wild, careening turns, propelled forward only by the desperate need to escape the horrors snapping at my heels. At one point, I felt rank breath and sharp claws graze the back of my neck before I put on a final burst of speed and lost my pursuer in the labyrinthine tunnels. Finally, after an eternity of gasping for air and pushing my battered body to its limits, I staggered out into a small chamber and collapsed against the clammy wall, chest heaving. I could no longer hear any signs of pursuit, and allowed myself a moment to catch my breath and attempt to collect my fractured thoughts. It was clear to me now, even through the haze of exhaustion and horror, that this was no ordinary threat I was facing. The things inhabiting these caverns, whatever they were, went far beyond the human serial killer, or even rabid animal, my ranger training had prepared me for. These were creatures out of mankind's most primal nightmares, the living embodiment of the fear that had caused our ancestors to huddle close to the campfire and pray the night would pass quickly. Was this what had happened to Mike and the other hikers, dragged down into this dank labyrinth to be sport for these horrifying entities? The bones I had seen piled in that chamber like so much refuse seemed to confirm it. But why was I still alive? Why hadn't they killed me yet, during the countless opportunities they had to overtake me in these tunnels where they clearly held every advantage? The thought arose, terrible in its implications, that perhaps something far worse than a quick death awaited me, some darker fate that involved being kept alive, at least for a time. I shuddered, bile rising in my throat again. I knew with grim certainty that I couldn't just keep stumbling around blindly in this hostile underworld. I needed a plan, a way to find Mike and any other survivors and get us all out. Forcing my leaden limbs to move, I started searching the small cavern I had ended up in, looking for anything I could use. To my surprise, I spotted a rusted metal lantern sitting in a crevice, along with a crumpled pack that looked like standard ranger gear. Hope flaring in my chest, I hurried over and snatched up my unexpected finds. The pack had definitely seen better days, its canvas exterior torn and filthy, but it contained a dented canteen with a bit of stale water, a coil of frayed rope, a handful of ancient-looking granola bars, and most valuable of all, a sparking flint to light the lantern with. Hands shaking with exhaustion and residual fear, I managed to coax the lantern wick to ignite, creating a much steadier light than the feeble, guttering flames of the torches. By its glow, I noticed a faded scrap of paper wedged into a crevice beneath where the lantern had rested. Tugging it free, I saw it was a torn, water-damaged page that appeared to have been ripped from an old leather-bound journal. The fragment was covered in a spidery, barely legible scrawl, made even harder to decipher by water stains and what looked disturbingly like old bloodstains. But I could just make out a few scattered phrases. The old stories are true. Beings older than mankind live in the deep caves, come up to hunt, lure the unwary into their domain, worship some dark power, an ancient evil. The words sent a chill through me, even though they revealed little I hadn't already guessed. Folding the scrap carefully, I placed it in my pocket, unsure if it would be of any use but unwilling to leave it behind. Trying to ignore my aching muscles and gnawing hunger, I hoisted the pack and held the lantern high. The thought of deliberately descending deeper into the earth, into the lair of those abominations, made my legs tremble with dread. But if there was even a chance Mike was still alive down there, I had no choice. Squaring my shoulders and taking a deep, shuddering breath, I started down a tunnel that trended downward, into the hungry darkness that awaited me. The lantern cast a feeble pool of light ahead of me as I crept down the sloping, narrow passageway, jumping at every flicker of shadow. The air grew increasingly dank and oppressive the deeper I went, like a physical weight pressing down on me. I tried to keep my breathing shallow and quiet, not wanting to alert any of the tunnel's murderous denizens to my presence. At the same time, I strained my ears for any sounds that might indicate Mike or the missing hiker were nearby, perhaps a moan of pain or a cry for help. But the only noises were the incessant drip of water and the occasional skittering of unseen creatures in the darkness. Each step I took required a monumental effort of will, every instinct screaming at me to turn and flee back the way I had come. But I pressed on. After descending for what felt like miles through countless twists and junctions in the tunnels, I stepped out into a massive cavern, so vast that my little lantern couldn't illuminate the far walls. I paused, trying to get my bearings in the echoing space. Then I noticed that the cavern wasn't pitch black like the tunnels had been. A dim, sickly green luminescence seemed to emanate from the walls and ceiling, casting everything in an unsettling underwater hue. As my eyes adjusted, I realized with dawning horror that the walls were covered in some sort of pulsing, semi-translucent slime, within which squirmed and undulated thousands of tiny larval creatures. They wriggled obscenely, pressing against the membranous surface as if trying to break free. The source of the eerie glow was unclear. Perhaps some bioluminescent property of the repulsive organisms or the mucus itself. Fighting down a surge of revulsion, I made my way cautiously into the immense chamber, senses straining. I hadn't gone more than a dozen steps when I noticed a series of stone outcroppings emerging from the cavern floor ahead of me, forming crude dais. And on these raised platforms, to my horror, crouched more of the ghoulish beings I had seen feasting earlier. They perched perfectly motionless, their elongated limbs folded beneath them, reminding me of mantises or some sort of awful insects waiting to spring on their prey. Their bulbous eyes glinted coldly in the directions of the various tunnel entrances to the great cavern, including my own. I froze, barely daring to breathe, an icy wave of terror crashing over me. Had they seen me yet? Just as I was about to edge slowly back the way I had come, there was a stirring from a platform in the center of the cavern, the largest of the bunch. A hunched, emaciated figure rose from the shadows there, and I felt the bile rise in my throat. While the other creatures were horrific enough, this monstrosity was of another level entirely. Its body seemed to be composed more of shadow than substance, a gaunt fleshless frame that shifted and flickered at the edges, as if not quite solid. Tattered remnants of clothing hung from its stick-like limbs, but worst of all was the face, little more than a grinning skull, with only scraps of rotting flesh clinging to it, and eyes that burned with a poisonous green fire in their sunken sockets. The being raised its skeletal arms in a gesture that almost looked like supplication, and spoke in a rasping, sibilant voice that scuttered obscenely along my skin and set my teeth on edge. Hashtu Morglash Kanath, Fakdan Relia. The words, if that's what they were, emerged not from the thing's lipless mouth, but rather reverberated from all around, as if the very air of the cavern was given loathsome voice. At this hideous utterance, the other creatures began to stir and chitter, a rising tide of agitation. I had no idea what the words meant, but they filled me with a primal, bone-deep dread. An instinctive knowledge that I was witnessing something profane and blasphemous, that had no place in a sane world. I began to back away, no longer caring about stealth, desperate to put as much distance as I could between myself and the ghastly scene playing out before me. But then, a flicker of movement on a smaller dais near the back of the cavern caught my eye. At first I thought it was just another one of the lurking horrors, but then I caught a flash of fabric, a very human groan of pain. My heart leaped to my throat. It was Mike, and from the looks of it the missing hiker too, both tied to the stone platform with what appeared to be slimy, pulsating ropes of the same nauseating organic material that coated the cavern walls. They both appeared to be unconscious or barely conscious, their heads lolling to the side, and crouched over them, a long serrated blade of some dark metal clutched in its bony claws, was another one of the most twisted and deformed of the creatures, like a high priest of this macabre ceremony. I knew with complete, terrifying certainty that I was about to witness a human sacrifice to whatever unspeakable forces these freakish entities served, and that I was utterly powerless to stop it. Even as my mind screamed at me to flee, I found myself rooted to the spot, unable to wrench my gaze away. The cavern fell silent, every unclean eye fixed on the tableau before us. The priest raised the jagged knife high, and I squeezed my eyes shut, mumbling a prayer to any god that would listen, knowing no salvation would be forthcoming. I braced myself for my friend's dying screams, but they never came. Instead, a sound that I can only describe as a roar of terrible otherworldly fury echoed through the cavern, shaking the very stone beneath my feet. My eyes flew open again to see the most extraordinary and terrifying sight I have ever beheld. Standing at another entrance to the vast chamber, eyes blazing and a dull red light glowing from beneath its skin as if its veins ran with fire, was an old Native American man. His grizzled features were contorted with incongruous rage, and what looked like disgust as he glared at the gathered abominations. He began to chant, the words an ominous rising cadence that sparked some deep ancestral memory. As the sonorous words rolled through the cavern, a brilliant flash of red illuminated the dank space, blinding after the eerie green glow. It coalesced into intricate, twisting symbols that seared themselves into the air before the old man like a fiery sigil. He thrust his gnarled staff toward the floating runes, shouting a word that sounded like "begone," but reverberated on a level beyond language. At this unmistakable banishment, the uncanny light intensified into an unbearable brightness, the symbols exploding outward to fill the chamber. The fiendish creatures began to screech and wail in a cacophony of anguish and rage. They writhed and contorted grotesquely as the glare consumed them, their misshapen forms unraveling like shadows under the noonday sun. And then, between one blink of my tearing eyes and the next, they were simply gone, leaving no trace that they had ever existed. Silence reigned in the now empty cavern, the last echoes of those horrible shrieks still ringing in my ears. My legs finally gave out beneath me, and I slumped to the cold stone floor, staring in uncomprehending wonder and residual terror at the old man who now seemed to be the only other living soul in that accursed place. He, in turn, fixed me with an unfathomable gaze, a look that somehow managed to convey grief, weariness, and something like recognition all at once. "I was almost too late," he pronounced in a voice roughened by age and sorrow. "They nearly opened the way for the Ancient Ones to return. We were lucky this time. Somehow, impossibly, I found my voice. What were those things? What just happened?" He shook his head slowly. "Pray you never have to truly know. They are abominations that have existed in the dark corners of the world since before mankind dreamed of fire. There are some doors that must remain closed, some powers that must not be awakened for all our sakes." With that, he turned and began to walk stooped and slow toward the platforms where Mike and the hiker remained. Still reeling, I clambered to my feet and stumbled after him, a million questions whirling in my stunned mind. I could only hope that with this inexplicable reprieve, I would have the chance to ask them. But for now, getting my fellow rangers to safety was all that mattered. The horrors, both witnessed and implied, could wait until we were far from this subterranean hell and back under the clean light of day, if indeed such a place still existed unchanged after all I had seen. The nightmares, I knew, would be with me always, but perhaps also a grim wisdom, that there are far fouler things lurking in the shadows of the world than anything I had ever imagined, and that sometimes the only light that can banish them is a single flame of human courage and compassion against the darkness. With these thoughts echoing in my mind, I reached the platform and set to freeing Mike and the hiker with trembling hands, praying I had the strength to lead them out of this abyss, praying that the world above still made a kind of sense, knowing on some deep soul level that my own world would never be quite the same. Mike groaned as I gently shook his shoulder, trying to coax him back to consciousness. His eyelids fluttered, then snapped open, confusion and fear flooding his gaze as he tried to sit up, straining against his repulsive bonds. "Easy, Mike. It's me, Jake," I said soothingly. "I'm going to get you out of here, but I need you to stay calm, okay?" Recognition slowly dawned on his battered face. "Jake? What's going on? Where are we?" His eyes darted around the cavern, as if expecting the horrors to re-emerge from the shadows at any moment. I couldn't blame him. "I'm not entirely sure," I answered grimly, starting to cut through the spongy ropes with my pocket knife. They were tough and rubbery, resisting the blade, but were getting out now. As soon as he was free, I moved to the other platform to work on the missing hiker's bindings. He was in even worse shape than Mike, barely conscious, his breath coming in shallow, rapid pants. Dark bruises and half-healed lacerations marred nearly every inch of visible skin, and his clothes hung off him in filthy tatters. It was clear he had endured unimaginable torments at the hands of our captors. I felt a presence at my elbow and glanced over to see the old Native American man crouching beside me. Up close, his weathered face was even more striking, etched with deep lines that spoke of a long life filled with both wisdom and sorrow. His eyes, though, were the most arresting, black as obsidian, and seeming to hold knowledge of things no mortal man should gaze upon. He reached out and laid a surprisingly strong hand on the injured hiker, muttering some words in a language I didn't recognize. The man stirred and let out a sigh, his breathing easing slightly. I looked at our strange savior in astonishment. He met my gaze levelly. "An old blessing," he explained, "to ease his suffering and give him strength for the journey ahead."
"Journey?
I repeated, hope kindling in my chest.
You know the way out?"
He nodded once. "These tunnels hold no secrets from me any longer. But we must move swiftly." His eyes flicked to the slime-covered walls, as if he could sense something beyond my perception. "The wardings I placed will not hold them back forever." A chill rippled down my spine at his words, and I redoubled my efforts to free the hiker. Between the two of us, we managed to get him off the dais and propped upright between us, his arms slung over our shoulders. Mike moved in to take some of the semi-conscious man's weight. Well, as we began to make our way towards the tunnel, the old man indicated, our steps echoing in the unnatural silence left in the wake of the creature's destruction. As we walked, I tried to process everything that had happened, my mind reeling. The things I had seen, the horrors I had witnessed, felt like something out of a fever dream, not reality. And yet the evidence was all around me. The eldritch cavern, the rescued hiker's injuries, the haunted look in Mike's eyes that I was sure was mirrored in my own. I turned to our mysterious guide, questions burning on my tongue. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice seeming too loud in the oppressive stillness. "How did you find us? What were those things?" He was silent for a long moment, the only sound our labored breathing and the scuff of our footsteps on the stone. Then he began to speak, his voice low and mesmerizing. "My name is John Blackfeather," he said. "I am a shaman of the Ojibwe people, who have lived in these lands since the time before memory. The creatures you saw are known to us as the Wendigoag, dark spirits of insatiable hunger and cruelty. They have haunted the deep places of the earth for centuries, preying on the lost and the unwary." He paused, his expression distant, as if seeing into a past only he could perceive. "My people have long fought to keep their evil at bay, passing down the old ways, the rituals and wards to bind them, from generation to generation. But as time goes on, fewer and fewer believe in the old stories, until it is too late." A shudder passed through me at his words. To think such nightmares were real, not just myths and legends, was almost too much to bear. Seeming to sense my distress, John laid a comforting hand on my shoulder. "You have faced these abominations and survived," he said solemnly. "That is no small thing. You have a strength and courage within you that few possess." I shook my head, feeling anything but strong or courageous. All I felt was fear and an overwhelming desire to see the sun again. "I just want to get out of here," I said hoarsely. John nodded. "And so we shall. But know this, Your encounter with the Wendigo will leave a mark, seen and unseen. You have touched the edges of their dark realm, and that is not something easily forgotten or escaped. His ominous words sent a chill through me, despite the stuffy air of the tunnels. I had a feeling he was speaking from personal experience. What horrors had he witnessed? What battles had he fought in his self-appointed role as guardian and guide through this underworld? I glanced over at Mike, seeing my own unease reflected in his eyes. The hiker between us remained mercifully oblivious, his head drooping to his chest. We had no choice but to trust in John Blackfeather to lead us out of this abyss and pray that he knew what he was doing. We trudged on in silence through the winding stone passages, putting the ghastly green cavern further behind us with each step. Though I tried to keep track of the turnings in case we needed to retrace our path, I soon became hopelessly disoriented. The tunnels seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them, taking on a new configuration that seemed subtly, unsettlingly wrong. It was as if the geometry of this place didn't quite obey the normal laws of reality. After what felt like hours, days, a lifetime of endless dank corridors and passages, we finally emerged into a small chamber with a shaft of blessed daylight spilling down from a crack high above. I nearly wept at the sight. John helped us maneuver the injured hiker up through the narrow crevice first, Mike boosting him from below while I pulled from above. Then Mike clambered up himself, cursing and scraping his knees and elbows in his haste to escape the oppressive tunnels. I turned to help John, but he waved me off. "Go," he said, something deep and unfathomable in his eyes. "Get your friends to safety. I will follow in my own time." I hesitated, torn between my bone-deep need to flee this place and my reluctance to leave this mysterious old man who had saved us all. As if sensing my thoughts, he offered me a small, sad smile. "Do not fear for me," he murmured. "I have walked in the darkness for longer than you can imagine, and I will continue to do so as long as I am needed. It is my burden and my privilege to stand against the hungry shadows so that others may live in the light." With those cryptic words, he turned and shuffled back down the tunnel, soon vanishing into the gloom. Despite the warmth of the sun on my face as I pulled myself up through the crack and out into the clean, bright air, a part of me remained in those dank passageways below, with John Blackfeather, guardian, guide, and enigma. I knew that I would never forget him, or the nightmares we had faced together in the caverns of the Wendigo. And though I longed to put this subterranean hell behind me and lose myself in the comforting normality of the surface world, his parting words lingered like a chill in my bones. For I had gazed into the abyss and witnessed the horrors that dwelled there. And I knew with a terrible certainty that my journey into the hungry darkness was far from over. The shadows would always be with me now, waiting, watching, whispering at the edges of my consciousness, calling me back to the endless tunnels and the abominations that lurked within. But for now, reunited with Mike and the hiker under the vault of blue sky, I let the sheer relief of survival wash over me. We had made it out alive, if not unscathed, and that would have to be enough for now. As the adrenaline began to drain away, exhaustion and reaction took its place. My knees buckled and I sank to the carpet of pine needles, breathing deeply of the crisp sap-scented air. Mike collapsed next to me, cradling his head and shaking hands. "I can't believe, what the hell just happened?" he croaked, his voice cracking. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "Except that everything we thought we knew about the world, about what's possible, was wrong." I could still see the hideous contortions of the Wendigoig, still hear their frenzied shrieks ringing in my ears. Mike looked up at me with haunted eyes. "How are we supposed to go back to our normal lives after this? Pretend like none of it happened?" I sighed deeply. "We can't. Those things are still down there in the dark, along with who knows what else, and now we know they're real." "So what do?" he asked, helplessly. I looked out over the serene vista of the forest, now seeming to conceal unimaginable horrors beneath its placid exterior. John Blackfeather's ancient, knowing gaze swam before my mind's eye. "We do what we've always done," I said slowly. "We watch over the wilderness, and we protect the people who venture into it, as best we can. Only now, we know what we're really up against, what we're really fighting to keep at bay." I thought of all the missing hikers whose final fates I had never discovered, and suppressed a shudder. How many of them had been dragged down into that abyss, never to return? Their numbers would likely only grow, I knew, as more and more people pushed into the wild places, heedless of the dire warnings and eerie tales. But perhaps some would be spared that horrific end, now that I knew the truth, now that I could recognize the signs and take precautions against the hungry ones that prowled the shadows. It wasn't much, set against the scope of the hidden evil that lurked below, but it was a start. If John Blackfeather and others like him had held the darkness at bay this long, then I could do no less than add my own light to that endless battle. For the sake of the lost and the innocent, I would stand watch. I would walk the forests and the deep places, ever vigilant, ever wary. I would be a keeper of the flame against the eternal night. As I pulled myself to my feet and reached down to help Mike up, I saw the same realization and resolve come into his eyes. He met my gaze and gave a single tight nod, a silent promise. Together, we slung the unconscious hiker's arms over our shoulders once more and began the long hike back to civilization, to hospitals and incident reports and debriefings, and perhaps in time to some semblance of normality. But a part of us would always remain in those dank tunnels with their chittering denizens, in that endless shadow realm where the Wendigo reigned. That knowledge, that grim burden, would never leave us. We had become brothers bound by blood and by secrets, inductees into the dark mysteries that lay beneath the surface of the world, and that fellowship, I knew, would last a lifetime. As the trees closed in around us, and the mountains swallowed the sun, I felt a new purpose take root in my soul beside the fear and the echoes of old screams. I was a ranger, a guardian, a light in dark places, and I had work to do. I was 19 when this happened, back in June of 2003, and even now, 20 years later, I can't shake the memory. Growing up in Wells, Nevada, there wasn't much to do except explore the endless miles of desert and mountains that stretched in every direction. My friends thought I was crazy for spending my weekends alone in those desolate places, but there was something about abandoned settlements and forgotten mining claims that called to me like a siren song. The burger joint in Wells had these old maps from the early 1900s preserved under glass on every table. I'd spent countless hours studying them while nursing a coffee, tracing my finger along roads that no longer existed, noting the locations of towns that had been swallowed by time. One map in particular caught my attention. It showed several settlements just north of Ruby Valley in Elko County, places with names like Prospect Creek and Silver Ridge that weren't on any modern map. I'd been planning this trip for weeks, gathering supplies and checking my gear. My 1972 Dodge W200 pickup was perfect for these expeditions, built like a tank and high enough to clear most obstacles. The truck was army green with rust creeping along the wheel wells, but the engine was solid and the four-wheel drive had never let me down. I'd inherited it from my grandfather, along with his love for the remote places where civilization had tried and failed to take hold. Being raised in a family of hunters and ranchers, I never went anywhere without protection. Wild animals were common in the Ruby Mountains, mountain lions, bears, and the occasional pack of feral dogs that had gone wild after being abandoned by prospectors decades earlier. My rifle was an HK-91, a semi-automatic .308 that my uncle had brought back from his time in the military. The weight of it was reassuring in my hands, and I could hit a target at 300 yards without breaking a sweat. The morning I set out was clear and calm, with the kind of crystalline air that made the mountains look close enough to touch. I filled the truck with gas, loaded my rifle with a 20-round magazine, and stuffed 2 spare magazines into my backpack along with water, jerky, and a first aid kit. My father asked where I was headed as I loaded my gear, and I told him I was exploring north of Ruby Valley. He paused in his coffee drinking and gave me a look I couldn't quite read. "Be careful up there," he said, which struck me as odd. My father wasn't the type to worry unnecessarily, but something in his voice made me take notice. Some places are forgotten for good reason. I laughed it off at the time, but his words would echo in my mind later. The drive from Wells to the Ruby Valley area took about 2 hours on Highway 93, passing through landscape that seemed untouched by time. The road stretched straight as an arrow across valleys dotted with sagebrush and Joshua trees, with mountains rising like purple walls on either side. Traffic was almost non-existent, maybe one car every 20 minutes. When I reached the turnoff that would take me into the valley proper, I stopped to check my map one more time. The modern road would take me only so far. After that, I'd be following mining roads and cattle paths that might not even exist anymore. The nearest town was more than 50 miles away, and cell phone coverage was non-existent in the mountains. If something went wrong, I'd be on my own. The paved road ended after about 10 miles, replaced by a dirt track that wound through stands of pinyon pine and juniper. The truck's suspension groaned as I navigated ruts and rocks, but I kept a steady pace, windows down to enjoy the mountain air. The temperature dropped noticeably as I gained elevation, and the silence was broken only by the rumble of my engine and the crunch of gravel under my tires. I passed several old homesteads in various states of decay, collapsed barns, rusted fence posts, and the scattered remains of what had once been someone's dream of making a life in this harsh country. Each one told a story of hope and eventual defeat, of families who had packed up and left when the mines played out or the winters became too brutal to endure. About 3 hours into the drive, I found what I was looking for, a barely visible track heading north into a canyon that didn't appear on any modern map. The entrance was marked only by a weathered wooden sign so faded I couldn't make out what it had once said. Ancient tire tracks were still visible in the hardpan, suggesting that someone had been this way before, though probably not recently. The path climbed steadily through dense stands of pine and aspen, their branches sometimes scraping against the sides of my truck. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the silence became. I'd expected to hear birds, insects, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, but there was nothing except the labored breathing of my engine as it worked to maintain traction on the increasingly steep grade. After another hour of slow progress, I encountered my first real obstacle, a massive pinyon pine that had fallen across the road. The tree was easily 2 feet in diameter and had been down for years, judging by the way smaller trees and brush had grown up around it. There was no way to drive around it. The canyon walls were too steep and the undergrowth too thick. I parked the truck and walked around the fallen giant, trying to estimate how much work it would take to clear a path. The tree had fallen naturally. I could see the rotted stump where it had broken off, probably during a severe winter storm. But what struck me as odd was the complete absence of saw marks or any attempt to clear the road. If anyone had been using this route regularly, they would have dealt with this obstacle years ago. Standing there in the shadow of that fallen tree, I felt the first stirring of unease. The silence was absolute now, so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat. I cupped my hands around my mouth and shouted, just to break the oppressive quiet, and my voice echoed off the canyon walls before being swallowed by the trees. No response came back, no bird calls, no rustle of disturbed wildlife, nothing. I decided to continue on foot, grabbing my rifle and extra ammunition before locking the truck. The fallen tree was easy enough to climb over, and on the other side, the road continued its relentless climb toward what the old map had marked as Prospect Creek. I estimated I had maybe 2 hours of daylight left, enough time to reach the settlement and explore before making the trek back to my truck. The road beyond the tree was in better condition than I'd expected, though still obviously abandoned. Someone had maintained it once, probably during the mining boom of the early 1900s, but nature was slowly reclaiming it. Wildflowers grew in the center strip, and saplings had taken root in cracks in the hardpan. Still, it was clearly defined and easy to follow as it wound deeper into the mountains. I'd been walking for about 10 minutes when I noticed the change in the forest around me. Below the fallen tree, the woods had been normal, thick with undergrowth, fallen logs, and the usual debris of a living ecosystem. But here, everything was different. The trees grew in unnaturally straight lines, as if they'd been planted rather than seeded naturally. The undergrowth was sparse, and what plants did grow seemed stunted and pale. More disturbing was the continued absence of sound. I'd spent enough time in the wilderness to know that even the quietest forest had background noise, the whisper of wind through leaves, the distant call of a hawk, the scurry of chipmunks through the brush. But here, the silence was so complete it felt like a physical presence pressing against my eardrums. After another 20 minutes of hiking, the road began to level out and curve to the right. Through the trees ahead, I could see a clearing and what looked like the remains of buildings. My pulse quickened with anticipation. This was what I'd come for, a piece of history that had been abandoned and forgotten, waiting for someone to rediscover it. But as I approached the edge of the clearing, that feeling of wrongness intensified. Something about this place didn't feel right. The air itself seemed heavier, pressing down on me like the moment before a thunderstorm. I stopped at the tree line and studied the scene before me, trying to identify what was triggering my unease. The settlement consisted of a main cabin and several smaller outbuildings, all in remarkably good condition for structures that had been abandoned for nearly a century. The cabin was a substantial log building with a stone chimney and what appeared to be a covered porch. The windows were intact, which was unusual. Most abandoned buildings I'd explored had long since had their glass broken by weather or vandals. I approached the cabin slowly, my rifle held ready, but not quite raised. The building was larger than it had appeared from the tree line, probably 200 square feet, with a high-pitched roof designed to shed snow. The logs were still solid, chinked with what looked like original mortar that had held up remarkably well. A wooden porch wrapped around the front and one side, with hand-carved railings that showed the skill of whoever had built this place. What really caught my attention were the windows. Not only was the glass intact, but there were curtains hanging behind them. Faded and moth-eaten, but definitely there. In my experience, anything made of fabric disappeared quickly in abandoned buildings, eaten by insects and small animals, or simply rotted away by moisture and time. Yet here were curtains that looked like they'd been hanging undisturbed for decades. I climbed the 3 wooden steps to the porch, wincing as they creaked under my weight. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. The front door was made of heavy wood with wrought iron hinges and a large brass handle that had tarnished to green. I tried the handle, expecting it to be locked, but it turned easily. The door swung open with a groan of protest from hinges that hadn't been oiled in decades. The interior of the cabin took my breath away, but not in a good way. Most abandoned buildings I'd explored were empty shells, stripped of anything valuable and left to decay. This cabin was fully furnished, as if the occupants had simply stepped out for a walk and planned to return for dinner. A substantial wooden table dominated the center of the main room, surrounded by 4 chairs with woven seats. Place settings for 4 people were arranged on the table: plates, glasses, silverware, even folded napkins. In one corner stood a wood-burning stove with a pile of split logs beside it. Pots and pans hung from hooks on the wall, and shelves held an assortment of dishes and cooking implements. Everything was covered with a thick layer of dust and cobwebs, but it was all there, as if waiting for someone to return and resume their life. The bedroom was equally disturbing. A large brass bed dominated the space, still made up with quilts and pillows that had somehow survived the decades. A dresser held personal items: a hairbrush with strands of gray hair still caught in the bristles, bottles of medicine with labels too faded to read, and a small, leather-bound book that crumbled when I tried to open it. On the walls hung photographs in wooden frames, their subjects long faded to ghostly outlines. I could make out the shapes of people, a family, I thought, but their faces were indistinct shadows. One photograph seemed better preserved than the others, showing 4 figures standing in front of this very cabin. 2 adults and 2 children, I thought, though the details were unclear. What really unnerved me was the sense that someone had left in a hurry. Drawers were pulled out, as if someone had been packing quickly. Personal items were scattered on the floor. In the kitchen, I found moldy remains of what might have been a meal, long since consumed by insects and time. Whatever had driven these people away, it had happened suddenly. I spent perhaps 20 minutes in the cabin, my unease growing with each passing moment. The place felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. It wasn't just the preserved state of everything, it was something deeper, a sense that I was trespassing in a place where something terrible had happened. The air inside felt thick and hard to breathe, carrying an underlying odor of mustiness and something else I couldn't identify. When I finally stepped back onto the porch, I was grateful for the fresh mountain air, despite its unnatural stillness. I decided to check the rifle chamber, and the metallic click of the bolt echoed across the clearing like a gunshot. The sound was reassuring, a reminder that I wasn't completely helpless in this place that seemed to exist outside normal experience. Behind the cabin, I noticed a stone-lined well with a wooden cover that had partially collapsed. As I approached it, I became aware of a new sound, a faint rustling that seemed to come from below ground. At first, I thought it might be wind moving through an underground passage, but the air above ground was completely still. When I was about 30 feet from the well, the smell hit me. It was the unmistakable stench of decay, sweet, cloying, and so intense it made my eyes water. I pulled my shirt up over my nose and mouth, but the odor seemed to penetrate everything. Something had died down there, and from the strength of the smell, it had been something large. I forced myself to move closer, despite every instinct screaming at me to turn and run. The rustling sound grew louder as I approached, and I realized it wasn't wind at all. Something was moving down in the darkness of that well, and whatever it was very much alive. I could hear scratching sounds like claws on stone, and what might have been breathing, low, labored, and definitely not human. The wooden cover of the well had rotted and partially collapsed, leaving a gap large enough for someone to fall through. I found a small stone and dropped it into the opening, counting the seconds until I heard it hit bottom. The well was deep, at least 40 feet, and from the echoing quality of the impact it opened into some kind of underground chamber. The smell was becoming unbearable, and the sounds from below were growing more agitated. I backed away from the well, my rifle now raised and ready. Whatever was down there had noticed my presence, and I had no desire to find out what it was. The logical part of my mind suggested it might be an injured animal that had fallen in and couldn't climb out, but some deeper instinct warned me that this was something far more dangerous. I decided to check the mine shaft I'd spotted earlier, hoping to find some clue about what had happened to the people who once lived here. The entrance was built into the hillside about 100 yards behind the cabin, with heavy timber supports framing the opening. Unlike the random holes I'd explored in other locations, this was clearly a professional operation, with rails for ore cars still visible, disappearing into the darkness. As I climbed toward the entrance, I noticed an unusual warm breeze flowing from the shaft. Most mines maintained a constant cool temperature, acting like natural refrigerators even in summer. But this air was warm and carried with it an even stronger version of the putrid smell I'd encountered at the well. The stench was so intense I had to stop several times to keep from gagging. The mine entrance was larger than I'd expected, probably 8 feet high and 6 feet wide, supported by massive timbers that showed signs of recent maintenance. That should have been my first warning. If this mine had been abandoned for decades, those timbers should have been rotted and collapsed. Instead, they looked solid and well-maintained, as if someone had been taking care of them. I pulled out my flashlight and pointed it into the tunnel. The beam illuminated perhaps 30 feet of the passage before being swallowed by darkness. The rails continued straight into the mountain, and I could see side passages branching off the main tunnel. What I couldn't see was any sign of the cave-in or flooding that usually made these old mines impassable. That warm breeze continued to flow from the depths, carrying with it not just the smell of decay, but other odors, unwashed bodies, rotting food, and something else that reminded me of a zoo or animal pen. I stood at the entrance for several minutes, fighting the urge to turn and run while trying to work up the courage to explore further. The sound came without warning, a low moan that echoed from somewhere deep in the mine shaft. It was definitely human in origin, but distorted in a way that made my skin crawl. The moan was followed by other sounds, scratching, scraping, and what might have been whispered words in a language I didn't recognize. I took one step into the mine entrance, my flashlight beam probing the darkness ahead. The warm air felt unnatural against my face, and the smell was so strong I could taste it. Another moan echoed from the depths, closer this time, and I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, multiple sets, moving toward the entrance. My rational mind tried to provide explanations. Maybe there were homeless people living in the mine, taking shelter in a place where they wouldn't be disturbed. Maybe what I was hearing was just someone in distress who needed help. But every survival instinct I possessed was screaming at me to get away from this place as quickly as possible. I was backing away from the mine entrance when I saw the first shadow moving in the depths. My flashlight beam caught a glimpse of something that shouldn't exist. A human figure, but wrong in ways that made my mind refuse to process what I was seeing. It was crouched low, moving on all fours like an animal, but the proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. The figure moved with a fluid grace that was somehow more terrifying than if it had shambled like a movie monster. This thing was fast, agile, and clearly intelligent enough to stay partially hidden in the shadows. As it drew closer to the entrance, I could make out more details that sent ice through my veins. Its skin was pale and mottled, stretched tight over a skeletal frame that looked like it belonged to someone who had been starving for months. But this wasn't simple malnutrition. This was something that had adapted to living in darkness, feeding on things that shouldn't be food. Its fingers were elongated and ended in what looked like claws or heavily overgrown fingernails. When it lifted its head, I caught a glimpse of its face in my flashlight beam. The features were human but distorted, as if someone had taken a normal person and stretched them like taffy. The eyes reflected the light like an animal's, and when it opened its mouth, I saw teeth that had been filed or worn into points. That's when it screamed. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Part human shriek, part animal howl, with an underlying note that seemed to vibrate in my bones. It was the sound of madness given voice, of pain and hunger and rage all rolled into one horrific cry. My ears rang from the assault, and for a moment I was paralyzed by the sheer wrongness of it. Training took over before conscious thought. I raised my rifle and put the front sight on what I hoped was center mass. The rifle bucked against my shoulder 5 times in rapid succession, the muzzle flash illuminating the mine entrance in strobing white light. I heard the distinctive sound of bullets hitting flesh, and the creature's scream changed pitch, becoming even more agonized. But that's when I realized this thing wasn't alone. The answering screams came from multiple directions, from deeper in the mine, from the area around the well, and from the hillsides above me. Whatever these things were, there were several of them, and they were coordinating their response to my presence. I heard the sound of rocks falling as something large moved through the trees above the mine entrance. I started running back toward the cabin, ejecting the empty magazine and slamming in a fresh one as I moved. Behind me, I could hear multiple sets of feet, or claws, hitting the ground as things emerged from the mine shaft. They were following me, and from the sounds they were making, they were angry. I made it about halfway to the cabin before I realized I was surrounded. These things, whatever they were, had spread out to cut off my escape routes. I could see movement in the trees on both sides of the clearing, shapes that moved too quickly and too fluidly to be normal humans. They stayed in the shadows, but I caught glimpses of pale skin and elongated limbs as they moved from tree to tree. The one I'd shot was still screaming somewhere behind me, but its cries were getting fainter. Either it was dying or it was moving away to nurse its wounds. But the others were very much active, and they were closing in. I could hear them communicating with each other. Not words exactly, but a series of clicks and guttural sounds that might have been some kind of language. I reached the cabin and took shelter behind the porch, using the structure as cover while I tried to spot targets. The rifle felt solid in my hands, but I only had about 15 rounds left, and I had no idea how many of these things I was facing. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat, and the oppressive silence that had marked this place was now broken by sounds of movement all around me. One of them broke cover, sprinting across the clearing in a hunched-over run that covered ground with frightening speed. I led the target and squeezed the trigger, hearing the bullet connect with a wet thunk. The creature stumbled and fell, but was back on its feet almost immediately, leaving a dark trail on the ground as it disappeared back into the trees. They were learning from my attacks, staying hidden and trying to get close enough to overwhelm me. I could hear them moving through the brush, circling the cabin like wolves. Every few seconds, one would show itself just long enough to draw my fire, then disappear before I could get a clean shot. I was down to my last magazine when I decided I had to make a break for the truck. Staying here was suicide. They would eventually work up the courage to rush me all at once, and there was no way I could fight them all off. My only chance was to reach the vehicle and get out of this nightmare place. I sprinted for the tree line, firing at anything that moved. Behind me, I heard the creatures give chase, their inhuman screams echoing off the canyon walls. They were fast, but they seemed reluctant to leave the cover of the trees. Every time one got close to the open road, it would duck back into the shadows. The fallen tree seemed like it was miles away, though I knew it was only a few hundred yards. I could hear them pacing me on both sides, staying hidden but matching my speed. When I finally reached the barrier, I threw myself over it with more desperation than grace, landing hard on the other side and scrambling for my truck. The engine turned over on the first try, and I threw the transmission into reverse without even closing the door properly. As I spun the truck around, my headlights swept across the forest, and I got my clearest look yet at one of my pursuers. It was crouched on a fallen log about 50 feet away, its pale skin almost glowing in the headlight beam. This one was larger than the others I'd seen, with broader shoulders and longer arms. It was definitely human in basic structure, but it had been changed by whatever circumstances had driven it to live in this forgotten place. Its face was gaunt and feral, with hollow cheeks and eyes that reflected the light like mirrors. For just a moment we stared at each other through the windshield. Then it opened its mouth and spoke, or tried to. The sounds that came out were almost words, garbled and slurred as if it had forgotten how human speech worked. But there was intelligence there, a mind that was still trying to communicate, even though it had been driven far beyond the boundaries of sanity. I gunned the engine and fled down the mountain road, not slowing down until I reached the highway. Even then, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see pale figures emerging from the darkness behind me. It wasn't until I was back in Wells, sitting in the familiar parking lot of the burger joint, that I finally felt safe enough to turn off the engine. I never told anyone the full story of what happened that day. How could I? Who would believe that somewhere in the Ruby Mountains, there were people who had been living like animals for decades, feeding on God knows what, and slowly losing their humanity in the process? I tried to convince myself that they were just homeless people, maybe mentally ill individuals who had taken shelter in the mine and been driven mad by isolation and starvation. But I knew better. What I'd seen wasn't just mental illness or malnutrition. Those things had been changed by their circumstances, adapted to a life that no human being should have to live. They'd found ways to survive in a place where survival should have been impossible, and in the process, they'd given up everything that made them human. When I got home that night, my father took one look at my face and knew something had happened. I told him I'd gotten lost and had to spend longer than expected getting back to the truck, but he wasn't buying it. Finally, he asked me directly if I'd found the cabin with the fallen tree across the road. When I nodded, he was quiet for a long time. Then he told me about the plane crashes, military aircraft that had gone down in the mountains during the 1940s and 50s, and the recovery teams that had been sent to retrieve the bodies. Most of the crashes had been successfully handled, but there had been one incident where the recovery team never made it back. Sometimes, he said, choosing his words carefully, people survive things they shouldn't survive. And sometimes what they become isn't something you'd want to meet in a dark place. He never elaborated, and I never asked for more details. But I understood what he was telling me. Those things in the mine weren't monsters. They were human beings who had been pushed beyond the breaking point and found ways to keep going that should have been impossible. 20 years later, I still think about that place. Part of me wants to organize an expedition, bring cameras and proper equipment, maybe even contact authorities about what might be living up there. But a larger part of me knows that some secrets are better left buried. Whatever happened to turn those people into the things I encountered, it's a kind of hell that no one should have to witness. I've never been back to Ruby Valley, and I never will. Some places are forgotten for good reason, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. The world has enough darkness without shining a light into corners where humanity has been stripped away and replaced with something that should not exist. But on quiet nights, when the wind is still and the world seems to hold its breath, I sometimes hear echoes of those screams, and I remember pale faces in the darkness, reaching out from a place where civilization failed, and something else took its place, something that might once have been human, but had forgotten what that word meant. That's my story. I've never shared the complete version before, and I probably never will again. But sometimes, the weight of carrying it alone becomes too much, and you have to tell someone even if they don't believe you. Because the alternative, pretending it never happened, feels like a betrayal of the truth, no matter how horrible that truth might be. The summer of 2019 marked my 16th birthday, and my parents thought it would be the perfect time to send me to Camp Riverside for what they called character building. Located on the remote coastline where Northern California meets Oregon, the camp stretched along a desolate stretch of rocky shore, bordered by dense redwood forests that seemed to swallow sound itself. The main feature that drew campers year after year was the unique geography. A narrow strip of land separated the churning Pacific Ocean from a perfectly still saltwater lagoon that had been cut off from the sea decades ago by shifting sands and rock slides. Our cabin, designated as Cabin 7, sat closest to this eerie body of water. The lagoon stretched nearly a quarter mile in length, its surface so still it looked like black glass during the day and reflected nothing but darkness at night. What made it even more unsettling was the complete absence of life within its waters. No fish, no water plants, nothing that suggested anything could survive in those depths. The counselors explained this away as a result of the unusual salt concentration and lack of circulation, but something about their explanations felt rehearsed, as if they'd answered this question many times before and wanted to discourage further inquiry. My 5 cabin mates were all around my age, 16-year-old kids from various cities across the Pacific Northwest. There was Preston, a lanky kid from Portland with nervous energy who constantly cracked his knuckles. Carlos from Seattle, built like a linebacker but with a surprisingly gentle demeanor. Brendan, the intellectual from San Francisco who brought more books than clothes. Joel, a quiet farm kid from rural Oregon who rarely spoke but observed everything. And Kevin, the jokester from Sacramento, who seemed determined to make light of every situation, no matter how serious. The cabin itself was a sturdy log structure built in the 1960s with a large deck that jutted out over the 20-foot drop to the lagoon below. The wooden railings were worn smooth by decades of campers, gripping them while staring into those dark waters. Inside, we had 3 sets of bunk beds arranged along the walls, with small windows that looked out toward either the forest or the lagoon. The floorboards creaked with every step, and the walls were thin enough that we could hear conversations from neighboring cabins during the day. What struck me most about the camp's location was how isolated it felt. The nearest town was over 40 miles away, down a winding mountain road that looked like it hadn't been properly maintained in years. Cell phone service was non-existent, and the camp's landline was restricted to emergencies only. It felt like we'd been transported to another era, cut off from the outside world entirely. The camp directors, Mr. Garrison and Mrs. Fletcher, seemed friendly enough during orientation, but I noticed how their smiles never quite reached their eyes when they talked about the camp's history. They mentioned that Camp Riverside had been operating for over 50 years, welcoming thousands of campers, but they glossed over details and changed the subject whenever anyone asked about specific incidents or why certain areas of the camp were marked as off-limits. Our cabin counselor was a college student named Derek, barely 21 years old, who seemed more interested in his summer reading list than in supervising 6 teenagers. He spent most of his time on the main deck with a book, occasionally glancing up to make sure we weren't doing anything too dangerous. His laid-back attitude meant we had more freedom than kids in other cabins, but it also meant we were largely left to entertain ourselves during evening hours. That first evening, after a dinner of questionable camp food and mandatory introductions around the campfire, we returned to Cabin 7 with nervous energy and the desire to assert some independence. Preston had smuggled in a deck of cards, and Kevin had brought an impressive stash of candy from home, so we decided to set up a poker game out on the deck. The sun was setting behind the redwoods, casting long shadows across the lagoon's surface and painting the sky in deep purples and oranges. We arranged ourselves around an old wooden crate that served as our makeshift table, with the candy serving as our betting chips. The evening air was thick with salt and the scent of pine, and the only sounds were the distant crash of waves against the rocky shore and our own whispered conversations as we tried not to wake Derek, who had already retreated to his private room at the back of the cabin. Brendan dealt the first hand with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent time in his father's underground poker games, while Carlos organized the candy into neat piles according to value. Joel sat quietly shuffling and reshuffling his cards, his farm boy instincts making him naturally cautious about revealing anything about his hand. Preston couldn't sit still, constantly adjusting his position and drumming his fingers against the wooden deck, the sound echoing in the stillness. Kevin kept up a running commentary on everyone's playing style, cracking jokes about Brendan's serious expression and Preston's obvious tells. But as the sky grew darker and the temperature began to drop, his jokes became more forced, and I noticed he kept glancing toward the lagoon with an expression I couldn't quite read. The game progressed slowly, with small victories and defeats as we learned each other's playing styles. The deck of the cabin hung about 12 feet above the lagoon's surface, and occasionally one of us would lean over the railing to peer into the black water below. During daylight hours, you could see perhaps 3 or 4 feet down before the water became completely opaque, but at night it was like looking into an abyss. Preston had just won a particularly large pot of chocolate bars when he froze mid-celebration, his hand still reaching for the candy. His expression shifted from triumph to confusion, then to something approaching fear. We all noticed his sudden stillness and turned to follow his gaze toward the lagoon, but saw nothing unusual, just the same dark water reflecting the first stars beginning to appear in the evening sky. "Did you guys hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. We all strained to listen but heard only the normal sounds of evening at camp. Distant laughter from other cabins, the soft murmur of counselors talking around the main fire pit, the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. Kevin made a joke about Preston trying to distract us from his winning streak, but his laugh sounded hollow and nervous. Then it came. The noise that erupted from the darkness around us was unlike anything I had ever heard before or have heard since. It was a sound that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and strike directly at some primitive part of the brain, the part that recognizes mortal danger even when the conscious mind doesn't understand what it's experiencing. Imagine the sound of metal being scraped against concrete, but amplified tenfold and given a organic, almost vocal quality that suggested it was being produced by something alive. It was high-pitched enough to make our teeth ache, but with undertones so low, they seemed to vibrate through the wooden deck beneath our feet. The sound lasted for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 15 or 20 seconds, building in intensity before cutting off abruptly, leaving our ears ringing in the sudden silence. All 6 of us shot to our feet simultaneously, cards and candy scattering across the deck as we stumbled backward toward the cabin door. Preston's face had gone completely white, and Carlos, who I'd never seen show fear about anything, was gripping the deck railing so tightly his knuckles had turned pale. Kevin's usual stream of jokes had dried up completely, and even Brendan, typically unflappable, was staring wide-eyed into the darkness surrounding the lagoon. The most disturbing aspect of the sound was how it seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't emanating from a specific direction that we could identify and potentially avoid. Instead, it filled the air around us completely, as if the darkness itself was producing it. Joel, who had grown up around every kind of wild animal in rural Oregon, shook his head slowly when Kevin asked if he recognized it. "Nothing makes a sound like that," Joel said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent countless nights listening to coyotes, mountain lions, and bears. "Nothing natural anyway." We scrambled inside the cabin, slamming the door behind us and turning the deadbolt with shaking hands. Derek emerged from his room, rubbing his eyes and asking what all the commotion was about. When we tried to explain what we'd heard, he listened with the patient expression adults use when they're humoring children's overactive imaginations. "Probably just coyotes," he said with a yawn. "They make all kinds of weird sounds, especially during mating season. Or maybe it was a mountain lion. They can sound pretty terrifying if you've never heard one before." But we knew it wasn't coyotes or mountain lions. Those were sounds from the natural world, sounds that belonged to creatures of flesh and blood and bone. What we'd heard was something else entirely, something that seemed to exist outside the normal rules of biology and physics. None of us slept well that night. We lay in our bunks listening to every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind through the trees, every distant sound that might indicate the return of whatever had produced that horrible noise. Preston tossed and turned constantly, muttering apologies every time his movement made his bunk springs squeak. Carlos lay completely still, but I could tell from his breathing that he was wide awake. Kevin's usual bedtime commentary was replaced by tense silence. Brendan spent the night reading by flashlight, claiming he wasn't tired, but I noticed he kept glancing toward the windows that faced the lagoon. Joel positioned himself in the bunk with the best view of the door, and I realized he was keeping watch, old farm instincts kicking in even in this unfamiliar environment. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, with a thick fog rolling in from the ocean that reduced visibility to maybe 50 feet in any direction. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to match our collective mood as we stumbled through breakfast, dark circles under our eyes and conversations conducted in hushed tones. During the morning activity period, while other campers participated in hiking and kayaking, the 6 of us made our way to the camp's small library housed in the main lodge. The building was older than our cabin, with thick stone walls and small windows that let in very little natural light. Inside, the air smelled of old books and wood polish, and our footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors. Near the front entrance, exactly as I remembered from the previous summer's brief visit, stood an old computer kiosk designed to help campers identify local wildlife. The interface was crude but functional, with recordings of dozens of animal sounds organized by species and habitat. We spent over an hour methodically going through every single recording, from common birds to the most exotic predators known to inhabit the Pacific Northwest. We listened to coyote howls in various contexts: territorial calls, mating calls, distress calls. We heard mountain lion screams, bear roars, elk bugles, and the calls of dozens of bird species. We even found recordings of less common animals like wolverines and lynx, sounds that few people ever hear in the wild. Nothing came close to what we'd experienced the night before. Brendan, with his systematic approach to research, began taking notes in a small notebook he always carried. He documented each sound we'd investigated and noted why it didn't match our experience. Preston grew increasingly agitated as we failed to find an explanation, pacing back and forth behind us, and occasionally making comments about how maybe we should just forget about it and enjoy the rest of our time at camp. Carlos suggested we ask other campers if they'd heard anything unusual, so we spent the lunch period casually questioning kids from the other cabins. The responses were universally negative. No one else had heard anything out of the ordinary. Some kids from Cabin 3, which was positioned farther from the lagoon, mentioned hearing what they thought might have been coyotes in the distance, but their description didn't match our experience. Even more troubling was the reaction we got from some of the older campers, kids who'd been coming to Camp Riverside for several summers. When we described the sound we'd heard, a few of them exchanged glances that suggested recognition, but they quickly changed the subject or found excuses to leave the conversation. One girl from Cabin 12, a 17-year-old named Vanessa, who'd been coming to the camp for 4 years, pulled me aside after lunch. "You're in Cabin 7, right?" she asked, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "The one closest to the lagoon?" When I nodded, her expression grew serious. "Look, I don't know what you guys heard last night, but if I were you, I'd request a transfer to a different cabin. Tell them you're having problems with your cabin mates or something. Just get away from that lagoon." Before I could ask her what she meant, she hurried away, leaving me with more questions than answers, and a growing sense that our experience was part of something larger, something the camp administration would prefer to keep quiet. That evening, we took every precaution we could think of. We closed and locked all the windows in the cabin, despite the stifling heat that built up inside. We moved our poker game indoors, arranging ourselves around one of the bunks instead of risking another night on the deck. Derek seemed amused by our behavior, joking about city kids being afraid of country sounds, but we noticed he didn't argue when we kept the cabin locked up tight. We tried to maintain normal conversation, playing cards and sharing stories from home, but everyone was on edge. Every normal sound, the settling of the wooden structure, the whisper of wind through the trees, the distant calls of actual wildlife, made us freeze and listen intently. Kevin's jokes became increasingly desperate, as if he could ward off our fear through sheer force of humor. Around 10:30, Derek announced lights out and retreated to his room. We lay in our bunks in the darkness, but sleep was impossible. The temperature inside the closed cabin was oppressive, and the air felt thick and stagnant. Preston was breathing heavily, almost hyperventilating, and Carlos kept shifting position, as if he couldn't get comfortable. The sound came again at approximately 11:15. This time it was noticeably louder and seemed to last longer than the night before. The horrible scraping, tearing quality was more pronounced, and underneath it was something that sounded almost like words, not words in any language we recognized, but syllables that suggested intelligence, purpose, communication. The vibrations through the cabin floor were strong enough to rattle the windows in their frames and make the bunk beds creak ominously. Joel and Kevin both sat up in their bunks simultaneously, and I could see their silhouettes in the faint starlight filtering through the windows. Brendan was writing frantically in his notebook, trying to document every detail while the sound was still fresh in his memory. Preston had pulled his pillow over his head and was making small whimpering sounds. When the noise finally ended, the silence that followed felt different from normal quiet. It was the silence of a world holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. We lay motionless for what felt like hours, afraid that any movement might trigger another episode. "It's getting closer," Joel whispered into the darkness, and none of us contradicted him because we all felt it too. Whatever was producing that sound was focusing on our cabin, learning our routines, perhaps even studying us. Derek never emerged from his room, even though the sound had been loud enough to wake anyone in the building. Either he was a much heavier sleeper than seemed possible, or he was deliberately ignoring what was happening. Both possibilities were equally disturbing in their own way. The next morning, Preston's parents came to pick him up. He'd called them at dawn from the camp's emergency phone, claiming he was violently ill and needed to go home immediately. We watched through the cabin windows as he threw his belongings into a duffel bag and practically ran to their car, never looking back toward the lagoon. His departure left the rest of us feeling abandoned and more vulnerable than before. If Preston, who'd always been the most vocal about investigating the mystery, was scared enough to leave camp entirely, what did that say about our chances of surviving whatever was happening? With Preston gone, the dynamic in our cabin shifted dramatically. The remaining 5 of us drew closer together, united by our shared experience and growing terror. We began taking turns staying awake throughout the night, establishing a rotation so that someone was always alert and watching for signs of danger. Kevin had abandoned his usual joking persona almost entirely, becoming quiet and jumpy. Carlos had started carrying a baseball bat he'd borrowed from the camp's sports equipment, claiming it made him feel more secure. Brendan filled page after page in his notebook, documenting every detail of our experiences and developing increasingly elaborate theories about what might be causing the phenomena. Joel had taken to spending his free time exploring the edges of the camp, looking for tracks or other physical evidence of whatever was producing the sounds. He found nothing. No footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no signs that anything physical had been moving around the lagoon at night. This absence of evidence was somehow more frightening than finding tracks would have been. The sound came every night now, always between 11 and midnight, always lasting longer than the time before. By the 4th night, it continued for nearly 5 minutes, building and falling in intensity like some kind of horrible music. The scraping quality had evolved into something more complex, with layers of different tones and rhythms that suggested multiple sources or a single source capable of producing incredibly complex vocalizations. Most disturbing of all, we began to detect patterns in the sounds, repetitive elements that suggested language or communication. Brendan was convinced that whatever was making the noise was trying to tell us something, though he couldn't imagine what or why. Joel thought it sounded more like hunting calls, the way predators sometimes use vocalizations to coordinate attacks or drive prey into specific areas. Derek's behavior became increasingly suspicious as the week progressed. He spent more and more time away from the cabin during evening hours, claiming he was meeting with other counselors or attending staff meetings. When he was present, he seemed nervous and distracted, constantly checking his watch and looking toward the windows that faced the lagoon. We caught him having whispered phone conversations that ended abruptly whenever one of us entered the room. On Thursday night, Kevin was on watch duty when he saw lights moving on the far shore of the lagoon. Not flashlights or lanterns, but pale, flickering illumination that seemed to dance just above the water's surface. He woke the rest of us, and we all witnessed the phenomena for nearly an hour before the lights gradually faded and disappeared. The camp administration's response to our growing distress was to suggest we were suffering from group hysteria brought on by sleeping too little and spending too much time together. Mrs. Fletcher offered to arrange transfers to different cabins for any of us who wanted to separate from the group, but none of us were willing to face this alone. By Friday, we had developed a detailed plan for staying awake all night and maintaining continuous observation of the lagoon. We arranged our sleeping bags so we all had clear views of the windows, and we positioned Carlos's baseball bat and several large flashlights within easy reach. Whatever was happening, we were determined to confront it directly rather than cowering in ignorance. Saturday night marked our final evening at Camp Riverside, and we approached it with a combination of terror and determination. If we were going to solve this mystery, it had to be tonight. After that, we'd be returning to our homes across the Pacific Northwest, and whatever we'd experienced would become just another summer camp story that no one would believe. Derek had disappeared entirely that evening, claiming he needed to help with preparations for Sunday's departure, but we suspected he was avoiding the cabin deliberately. This left us completely alone as darkness fell and the familiar oppressive silence settled over the lagoon. We had refined our watch system over the course of the week, with one person maintaining constant observation while the others rested in shifts. Tonight, however, all 5 of us stayed awake, positioned around the cabin with clear sight lines to every window and the door. Brendan had organized his notebooks and was ready to document everything in detail. Carlos gripped his baseball bat with white knuckles. Joel had positioned himself near the door, ready to either defend us or lead an escape if necessary. Kevin sat by the largest window facing the lagoon, his usual humor completely absent. The sound began earlier than usual that night, starting as a low vibration that we felt in our bones before we could actually hear it. As it built in intensity, the familiar scraping quality was joined by new elements, clicking sounds like insects, low moaning that reminded us uncomfortably of human voices in distress, and an underlying rhythm that seemed almost musical. But tonight was different in a crucial way. Tonight we could tell exactly where the sound was coming from. It was rising from the lagoon itself, starting from the deepest parts of the water and echoing off the rocky shores until it filled the air around us. Kevin, positioned at the main window, began making urgent gestures for the rest of us to join him. His face was pale with shock, and his hands were shaking as he pointed toward the water. The surface of the lagoon, which had been perfectly still every night for the past week, was now churning with activity. Large shapes moved beneath the dark water, creating waves and ripples that caught the faint starlight and reflected it back in disturbing patterns. Whatever was down there was massive. The displacement of water suggested something much larger than any known aquatic animal. As we watched in horrified fascination, portions of the lagoon began to emit that same pale, flickering light Kevin had seen earlier in the week. The illumination pulsed in rhythm with the sounds, creating an hypnotic display that was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Then, at the height of the auditory assault, something broke the surface of the water. What we saw defied every rational explanation we could construct. It wasn't a creature in any biological sense. It was more like a distortion in reality itself, a dark shape that seemed to bend light around it and make our eyes water when we tried to focus on it directly. It moved with fluid grace, despite having no clearly defined anatomy, rising from the lagoon's depths like a living shadow given substance. The thing, for lack of a better word, approached the shore directly below our cabin. As it moved through the shallow water near the bank, we could see that it displaced liquid without creating the ripples or splash patterns that any physical object should produce. It was as if the water itself was rearranging to accommodate something that wasn't entirely present in our reality. Joel made a sound deep in his throat, something between a gasp and a moan, and stumbled backward from the window. Carlos raised his baseball bat, though what good a wooden club would do against something that might not even be fully material was anyone's guess. The entity paused at the water's edge, and though it had no visible sensory organs, we all felt the overwhelming certainty that it was looking directly at us. The sound it produced intensified, taking on new harmonic layers that seemed to resonate inside our skulls. Brendan's pen fell from his nerveless fingers, and his notebook slipped to the floor as he stared in shock. What happened next challenged everything we thought we understood about reality, consciousness, and the boundaries between the living and the dead. The entity began to rise from the lagoon, not climbing onto the shore, but simply elevating itself through space as if gravity had no hold on it. As it ascended toward our cabin's deck, its form became more distinct, while simultaneously becoming more impossible to comprehend. It was roughly humanoid in shape, but wrong in every proportion. Its limbs were too long, joints bending in directions that shouldn't be possible. What might have been a torso stretched and contracted, as if it were made of smoke rather than solid matter. Most disturbing of all, where a head should have been, there was only a roiling mass of darkness that hurt to look at directly. The sound it produced was no longer coming from any specific part of its body. Instead, the noise seemed to emanate from the air around it, from the wooden deck beneath our feet, from inside our own minds. It was communication of a sort, but not communication meant for human understanding. We were receiving information, but our brains weren't equipped to process what we were learning. Kevin collapsed to his knees, pressing his hands against his ears in a futile attempt to block out the psychic intrusion. Carlos swung his baseball bat at the window, not trying to hit the entity, but simply needing to do something, anything, to assert some form of control over the situation. The wooden bat splintered against the reinforced glass, leaving him holding a broken handle. Brendan, remarkably, was still trying to document what was happening, scribbling notes even as his hands shook so violently the words were barely legible. Joel had backed himself into a corner, farm boy pragmatism warring with the evidence of his senses as he tried to process something that simply couldn't exist. I found myself pressed against the far wall of the cabin, legs too weak to support my weight properly, staring at the impossible thing that hovered just outside our windows. It wasn't threatening us in any conventional sense. It wasn't trying to break in or harm us physically. Instead, it seemed to be studying us, learning about us, perhaps trying to understand us in the same way we were trying to understand it. The realization that struck me then was more terrifying than anything we'd experienced so far. This thing had been here all along. It lived in the lagoon, in the isolated waters that supported no conventional life, and it had been watching campers for decades. The off-limits areas, the rehearsed explanations from counselors, the way older campers reacted when we described our experiences. It all made sense now. Camp Riverside was built here specifically because of the entity, not in spite of it. The camp served as a kind of feeding ground, providing the creature with a steady stream of young minds to study and influence. We weren't the first group to experience these encounters, and we wouldn't be the last. Derek's absences, his nervous behavior, his deliberate avoidance of the cabin during our encounters, he knew exactly what was happening. The entire staff knew. They were complicit in whatever relationship existed between the camp and the thing in the lagoon. As this understanding crystallized in my mind, the entity's attention seemed to sharpen, focusing on me with an intensity that made my vision blur and my ears ring. It had detected my realization, my sudden comprehension of the larger truth, and it was pleased. Not pleased in any human sense, but satisfied that its study of our group had yielded the desired results. The sound it produced changed, becoming almost conversational, as if it were explaining something important that we needed to understand. But the explanation wasn't meant for our conscious minds. It was being written directly into our subconscious, becoming part of our memories and dreams and nightmares. We would leave Camp Riverside the next morning, return to our normal lives, and carry this experience with us forever. We would never speak of it to our parents, our friends, or anyone else who hadn't shared it with us. Not because we chose to keep it secret, but because the entity had made it impossible for us to communicate the truth to anyone who wasn't already part of its expanding network of witnesses. Years later, some of us would find ourselves drawn back to isolated bodies of water, standing at the edges of dark lakes and ponds, listening for sounds that shouldn't exist. Others would discover that they could hear things that other people couldn't, sounds from places that existed between reality and something else entirely. The entity retreated back into the lagoon as dawn approached, sinking below the surface with the same impossible grace it had displayed while rising. The water became still once more, reflecting nothing but empty sky, giving no indication that anything extraordinary had ever disturbed its depths. We packed our belongings in silence that Sunday morning, avoiding each other's eyes and speaking only when absolutely necessary. The bus ride home was conducted in uncomfortable quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts and trying to process what we'd experienced. I never saw Carlos, Brendan, Joel, or Kevin again after that summer. We had each other's contact information, but none of us ever used it. The experience had bonded us together in a way that was simultaneously profound and unbearable. We were connected now to something larger than ourselves, part of a network of witnesses that stretched back decades and would continue to grow with each new group of campers who spent a week in Cabin 7. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is still and the darkness seems deeper than it should be, I can still hear that sound echoing across the years. It's calling to others now, drawing new witnesses to remote places where reality grows thin and impossible things wait in the depths of dark water. Camp Riverside is still operating, still welcoming teenagers for character-building summer experiences. The lagoon is still there, still lifeless on the surface, still hiding something that defies every rational explanation. And somewhere in that dark water, the entity continues its ancient study of human consciousness, adding new voices to its ever-growing chorus of witnesses. God help the next group of kids who get assigned to Cabin 7. The five of us had been planning this camping trip for months. Me, Jack, Ryan, Mike, and Chris, buddies since high school, looking for one last adventure together before we all went our separate ways after college graduation. We decided on a week-long trek deep into the remote wilderness of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. I had grown up in a small town in Michigan's Lower Peninsula, spending countless hours exploring the local woods as a kid. I loved being immersed in nature, getting away from the noise and distractions of modern life. When my friends suggested this ambitious trip, pushing ourselves to the limit in some of the country's most rugged backcountry, I eagerly agreed. Little did I know that we were about to get far more adventure than we bargained for, that the local legends I had heard whispers about growing up, dark tales of strange creatures and sinister forces lurking in the ancient forests, were more than just stories. That in just a few days, my entire understanding of the world, of what's real and what's possible, would be shattered beyond repair. But in that moment, as we gathered our gear and supplies, spirits high with anticipation, all I could think about was spending quality time with some of my oldest friends before our lives inevitably diverged. We had been through so much together, heartbreaks and triumphs, laughter and tears. This trip felt like a fitting capstone to this chapter of our lives. If only I had known it might be the last time I would see some of them alive, that the bonds of our friendship were about to be tested in the most horrific way imaginable. But ignorance was bliss as we set off, making the long drive north to the trailhead where we would begin our journey into the unknown. Along the way, we made a few stops to pick up some last-minute supplies, extra batteries for our flashlights, some energy bars, and trail mix for snacking. As we traveled further from civilization and the towns got smaller and further apart, a sense of unease started to creep into my gut. I shrugged it off as just nerves or anticipation. We reached the access road by late afternoon. It was little more than a gravel path, overgrown with weeds, that stretched off into the rapidly darkening forest. According to the map, it was still several miles to the trailhead where we planned to camp for the night before starting our hike the next morning. As Chris maneuvered his SUV over the bumps and ruts, branches scraping disconcertingly against the windows, we started joking to break the tension, trading ghost stories and urban legends from our respective hometowns and speculating what we might encounter out here in the middle of nowhere. "I heard there are packs of wolves in some of these woods," Mike said. "Like bigger than normal wolves, more aggressive too." "Nah, I bet it's Bigfoot," Jack replied with a grin. "Maybe we'll catch a blurry glimpse of him and finally prove he exists." I forced a chuckle, but inside my sense of foreboding only grew stronger. The stories from my youth were coming back to me now with startling clarity. Tales of people venturing into the woods and never returning, of strange sounds in the night, and sightings of unnatural creatures. At the time, I had dismissed them as silly superstitions. Now I wasn't so sure. We reached the empty trailhead parking lot just as the last traces of daylight were fading. Hurriedly, we unloaded our gear, set up our tents, and built a small fire. The night settled over us, a cloak of impenetrable darkness pierced only by the dancing flames and the beams of our flashlights. Strange animal calls echoed from the void around us. Huddled around the campfire, we cooked some hot dogs on sticks, cracked open some beers, and tried to recapture our earlier excitement. But an ineffable heaviness now hung in the air. An almost primal sense of being watched, of not being welcome here. I couldn't quite put it into words. Couldn't tell if my friends felt it too, or if it was just my imagination running wild. If I had heeded my intuition then, if we had simply packed up our things, driven away and never looked back, maybe things would have turned out differently. Maybe the horrors to come could have been avoided. But in that moment, slightly buzzed and not wanting to wimp out in front of my buddies, I pushed my unease down deep inside me and tried to focus on the good times ahead. As we zipped ourselves into our tents that night, the first ominous howl pierced the air. High and quavering, it sounded close. Too close. Mike made a joke about it probably being a coyote, but I thought I detected a note of tension in his voice that matched my own. The howl came again, even closer, followed by another and another. Soon the night was alive with the eerie chorus. None of us slept very well that night, and that was only the beginning. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly as we emerged from our tents, low clouds sheathing the tops of the towering pines around us. The events of the previous night almost felt like a dream. Surely those unearthly sounds were just coyotes or wolves, right? Nothing to be alarmed about out here in the untamed wilderness. At least that's what we tried to convince ourselves as we scarfed down some instant oatmeal and broke camp. But as we shouldered our heavy backpacks and set off down the muddy trail, I couldn't shake my lingering unease. The forest felt different in the gloomy daylight, almost malevolent, like we were trespassing in a place we didn't belong. The rough path, overgrown with roots and vegetation, led steadily uphill, deeper and deeper into woods. "Hey, did you see that?" Ryan suddenly asked after about an hour of hiking, pointing off into the dense tangle of underbrush to our right. We all stopped and followed his gaze, but none of us spotted anything out of the ordinary. "See what?" Jack asked. "I thought I saw—" "Never mind, it's nothing. Let's keep going," Ryan replied. But I noticed he kept casting nervous glances over his shoulder after that. As the day wore on, the drizzle thickened into a penetrating chilly rain, cutting through our rain gear and dampening our spirits. According to the map and compass, we still had a ways to go before reaching the first backcountry campsite. The path ascended a series of steep hills and rocky outcroppings, the monotony broken only by the occasional stream crossing or small waterfall. During one break, huddling under a makeshift shelter made from a tarp to eat some beef jerky and trail mix, Mike remarked that he hadn't seen a single sign of civilization all day. No footprints, fire rings, or litter indicating other hikers. Unusual for such a scenic area, even if it was remote. "Well, that's kind of the whole point," Chris said, "to get away from the crowds and experience some real solitude." "I know, but doesn't it feel like we're the only people for 100 miles in any direction?" Mike pressed. "It's a bit eerie, that's all." Now that he mentioned it, the absence of any human traces was a bit disconcerting. Combined with the steadily worsening weather and the gloom of the forest, an unmistakable air of isolation and vulnerability crept over us. We hurried to pack up and get moving again, simply to have something to focus on, other than our growing discomfort. Shortly after that, we made a chilling discovery. Right in the middle of the trail, illuminated by the weak light filtering through the rain-soaked canopy, was a large paw print in the mud. Except paw didn't really do it justice. The impression was as wide as my splayed hand, and the individual claw marks at the tips were inches long. It reminded me of a bear track, except bigger. Much bigger. We all exchanged uneasy glances. There weren't supposed to be grizzly bears in Michigan, right? And even if there were, what kind of bear could possibly leave a print that massive? When I knelt down to examine it more closely, I noticed a strange pattern of smaller markings surrounding the main track, almost like arcane symbols. A shudder ran through me that had nothing to do with the rain or the cold. Maybe we should head back," Jack suggested, trying to keep his voice steady. "This doesn't feel right." For a split second, we all considered it. The thought of just turning around, returning to the world we knew and understood, was powerfully tempting. But some combination of stubbornness, peer pressure, and misplaced bravado made us push onwards in the end. Mike reasoned that whatever animal made that track was probably long gone by now, and after coming all this way, none of us wanted to admit defeat without reaching our goals. So we nervously continued, hyper-alert for any other signs of the creature, as the path wound deeper into the sodden grayness. With every passing minute, every squelching step, I felt like we were crossing an invisible threshold into a primordial world governed by forces we couldn't begin to comprehend. A world that was perhaps better left undisturbed. After several more arduous miles, we straggled into the backcountry campsite by a small lake, utterly exhausted and chilled to the bone. It took us longer than it should have to get tents set up and a fire started with numb fingers and waterlogged kindling. To our immense relief, the rest of the evening passed without incident. There were no more unearthly howls, no signs of that impossibly large creature besides the single paw print we had stumbled across. Maybe, I dared to hope, it had all been a product of our overactive imaginations and the oppressive atmosphere of the deep woods. But that fragile optimism shattered in the darkest hours of the night when I awoke suddenly to the sounds of screams and the unmistakable sensation that something was terribly, terribly wrong. I jolted upright in my sleeping bag, my heart pounding in the darkness. For a disoriented moment, I thought perhaps the screams had just been part of a nightmare, some lingering fragment of dream. But then they came again, long, wavering shrieks of mortal terror and agony that sent ice water flooding through my veins. And judging by their volume, they were coming from the tent right next to mine, Mike and Chris's tent. Frantically, I fumbled for the zipper of my tent flap and spilled out into the campsite. The fire pit was little more than glowing coals, but as my eyes adjusted, I could see a scene of utter chaos in the flickering light. Mike and Chris's tent had collapsed, the shape of their thrashing bodies straining against the fabric as they cried out. And something else was in there with them. A hulking, snarling black form with glowing red eyes that hinted at an impossible size. I dimly registered Ryan and Jack stumbling out of their tent as well, the horror in their exclamations mirroring my own shock. Before any of us could react further, there was one last piteous shriek and then a wet, ripping sound that made my stomach turn. The screams stopped abruptly. Something large rustled inside the ruined tent, and then, to my further revulsion, began audibly feeding. Oh my God," Ryan was saying, over and over, his voice high and hysterical. "What is that thing?" I had no words to answer. Some deep, primordial instinct had taken over my body, flooding my system with adrenaline. Without thinking, I lunged for my backpack, still with most of my gear inside, and swung it over my shoulders. "We have to get out of here now," I yelled at Jack and Ryan. "Into the woods. It's our only chance." I didn't wait for a response before plunging into the dark tangle of trees, thorns tearing at my clothes. Blind, mindless panic carried me forward, crashing through the underbrush with no thought for direction or destination, just away, far away from the nightmare behind us. After a few minutes, when the burn in my lungs and legs made it impossible to run any further, I stumbled to a stop and looked back. I could no longer see the faint glow of our campfire. The woods were utterly still. No screams, no sounds of pursuit. I strained my ears but couldn't hear Jack or Ryan either. An awful sinking feeling grew in my gut as I contemplated the implications. Was I now alone out here? Had we all just scattered in different directions? But before I could fully process this new horrific development, an alien sound shattered the quiet night. It was vaguely similar to the howls we had heard the previous evening, except deeper, more guttural, and filled with a savage, triumphant bloodlust that sent a bolt of primitive terror straight down my spine. It was coming from the direction of our abandoned camp, and judging by the way it echoed off the hills, bouncing and overlapping itself, it wasn't just a single source. There were multiple creatures out there, and they were on the hunt. I broke into a stumbling run again, whipped onward by a fresh jolt of fear. The forest had become a hostile labyrinth, every shadow a lurking threat. Tree branches snatched at me like claws, and I had to bite back a scream every time I brushed against something in the dark. But far worse than the physical obstacles were the noises that began to grow behind me, getting steadily louder, rustling and snapping of vegetation, excited snarls and whines, like a pack of predators zeroing in on frightened prey. I didn't dare look back, terrified of what I might see gaining on me. But I could feel the prickle on the back of my neck that meant something was watching me, stalking me. Whatever these creatures were, wolves or bears or something infinitely more sinister, they clearly knew this terrain far better than I did. And they could smell my fear, using it to track me through the pitch black. I felt like a mouse in a brutal game of cat and mouse, hopelessly outmatched and out of my depth. My foot caught a root, and I went sprawling, my backpack flying, the breath knocked out of my lungs. I frantically rolled over, expecting fangs to sink into my flesh at any moment, but instead saw two pinpricks of light approaching in the distance, bobbing and weaving between the trees. Flashlights. "Jack, Ryan," I called out desperately. "Is that you?" A wave of relief crashed through me as I recognized my friends' panting voices calling back. Apparently, we had all instinctively run in the same direction. I staggered upright and hurried toward them on badly shaking legs. But our reunion was tainted by shared grief and ongoing terror. In broken half-sentences, they filled me in on what little more they had seen. The hulking thing that had butchered Mike and Chris was like no animal any of us had ever witnessed. When it bounded out of the wrecked tent and loped off into the forest, Ryan had gotten a glimpse of its full body in the firelight and said it almost seemed to be walking upright at times, like some twisted werewolf from a horror movie. And now several of the beasts were undoubtedly still out here, tracking us. We had no weapons, no shelter, no idea where we were in relation to the trail or the road. I cursed myself for ever agreeing to this trip, for ignoring the dread that had nagged me from the start. Our hubris and complacency had led us straight into a deadly trap with no obvious way out. But we couldn't just give up. Mike and Chris deserved better than that. And I sure as hell wasn't about to lay down and die in this godforsaken forest without a fight. I still had my backpack with a bit of gear, and Jack and Ryan had managed to grab theirs as well. We would have to rely on our wits and diminishing adrenaline to survive the night. And so, with the baying of the creatures still echoing far too close for comfort, we fled deeper into the shadowed woods, not knowing what further horrors lay ahead of us. The only thing we knew for certain? We were now playing by an older, wilder set of rules, and the odds were decidedly not in our favor. I'd like to say that things got better after that initial horrific attack, that we managed to find a moment to catch our breaths and get our bearings. But the truth is, we remained in a state of constant mortal terror, a nightmare from which there seemed to be no waking. The forest itself seemed to turn against us, determined to thwart our escape at every turn. We quickly became hopelessly disoriented, unsure which direction the road lay. The clouds obscured any stars that could aid in navigation, and our compass seemed to spin aimlessly, giving no clear bearing. It was as if some unseen force was deliberately clouding our minds, herding us inexorably deeper into the wilderness. Several times we blundered into marshy, sucking bogs that threatened to drag us down into their rank depths. Thorny underbrush tore at our skin and clothes, leaving us bleeding from 100 small cuts. And always, always, there was the feeling of being watched, stalked, toyed with by an intelligence far greater than our own. We snatched moments of fitful rest only when sheer exhaustion demanded it, slumping against tree trunks with our hearts still racing. But every time we closed our eyes, gruesome images assaulted us. Visions of Mike and Chris's final moments, the ravenous creature that had torn them apart. We jerked awake over and over, unsure if the sourceless rustling and creaking around us was real or imagined. As if the physical hardships and mental strain weren't enough, it soon became apparent that we were being hunted by more than just the creatures. Something dark and insidious was seeping into our minds, exploiting our mounting dread and despair. It started as a faint whispering at the edges of my consciousness, easy to dismiss as the product of an overstressed mind. But as the night wore on, the voice grew louder, taking on a pervasive quality that I couldn't shut out no matter how hard I tried. "You're going to die out here," it hissed venomously. "Just like your friends, one by one, the beasts will rip you to shreds and feast on your flesh. It's inevitable." I clapped my hands over my ears, but it made no difference. The whispering seemed to emanate from inside my own skull. Judging by my friends' haunted expressions, they were experiencing the same disturbing phenomenon. "There is no escape," the voice continued relentlessly. "You are miles from any hope of rescue. No one will ever find your bodies. Give in to the fear. Let it consume you." With an effort of will, I wrenched my mind away from the insidious murmuring. I couldn't let it overwhelm me, sap what remained of my fragile resolve. But it was clear that whatever malign force lurked in this forest could not only hunt us physically, but mentally as well, preying on our deepest anxieties. Desperation and dwindling hope made time seem to slow to a torturous crawl. Minutes felt like hours like eternities as we plodded onward in a daze of misery, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig making us flinch. My muscles burned and my lungs ached, but it was nothing compared to the acid bite of Jack's dire question. What if we're just walking in circles? What if there is no way out and this is just some sort of sick game to that thing? I had no reassuring response to offer. With each passing moment, the possibility that we had stumbled into not just a physical territory, but a spiritual domain not meant for humans felt more and more plausible. A place where the normal rules of nature held no sway. As if to punctuate that grim thought, an abrupt change in the cadence of baying and howling in the distance reached my ears. The undulating cries took on a new note, one of triumph and imminent attack. They had found us again, and this time sounded much, much closer. "Run," I croaked through a parched throat. "We have to move now." Galvanized by pure survival instinct, we crashed blindly through the underbrush, half falling down a brushy ravine in our haste. Branches slapped our faces and hidden rocks turned our ankles, but we barely felt them, too focused on the sounds of large bodies bounding through the woods behind us, closing the gap with horrifying speed. Then Ryan, slightly ahead of Jack and I, let out a sudden cry. But it was one of surprise and cautious relief, not pain or fear. "I see a light. I think there's a cabin up ahead." A structure, even a dilapidated outpost, meant a chance of shelter and defensible walls. We surged toward it in a final burst of desperate energy. The ramshackle cabin appeared out of the darkness, its windows glowing dimly from some sourceless interior light. Rotten wooden steps groaned under our weight as we leaped onto the sagging porch. I wrenched open the door, praying it wasn't locked. Mercifully, it swung open, and we piled through, slamming it behind us. The single room was barren and thick with dust, cobwebs stringing the ceiling. Besides a rickety chair and table, the only feature was a cold stone hearth. But I hardly registered the details, too busy frantically dragging the table in front of the door as a barricade, while Jack and Ryan shoved the chair under the handle as a wedge. No sooner had we finished our crude fortifications than a heavy weight slammed into the walls, rattling the entire cabin on its foundation. I yelped in shock, retreating to the center of the room as the impacts intensified, claws raking across the outer planks, a chorus of snarls and guttural roars shaking the night. We had reached a temporary refuge, but for how long? The creatures had us surrounded and besieged, the door and fragile walls the only things holding them at bay. How sturdy was this building? Would it withstand a sustained assault by beasts of unnatural strength? And what dark surprises might lurk inside it? There was no time to ponder those dire questions. The creatures battered the cabin with relentless fury, dust motes dancing in the air with each shuddering impact. Paralyzed with primordial fear, we could only huddle together and pray that the long claws rending the wood couldn't find a way in. But the true threat, I would soon discover, came from the innocuous stone hearth. I had assumed it was long cold, unused for years. But as I stared in numb horror, faint lines began to appear in the soot caked on its surface. Lines that resolved into eldritch symbols, pulsing with a glimmer of unwholesome purple light. Symbols that looked unnervingly similar to those we had seen around the massive paw print on the trail earlier. With dawning comprehension came the icy realization. The cabin wasn't a sanctuary. It was a sacrificial altar. And by entering it, we hadn't escaped the trap. We had sprung it. The hideous implication struck me like a hammer blow. This was no coincidence or stroke of bad luck that had led us to this decrepit cabin. Sinister intent had guided our every nightmarish step, driving us with ruthless calculation to this very room, this very moment. We weren't just being hunted, we were being harvested. But before the reality could sink in, before I could voice a warning to Jack and Ryan, new motion within the stone fireplace arrested my attention. The plumes of dust hanging in the air began to stir and swirl as if sifted by an unseen hand. Then, to my uncomprehending disbelief, the motes coalesced into a face. It hovered in midair, vaguely human in shape, but gaunt and hollow-cheeked to the point of emaciation. A ghostly purple light smoldered in the depths of its empty eye sockets, blazing with cruel awareness. When it spoke, its voice was the papery whisper of long-dead leaves scudding across a moonlit crypt. At last, fresh blood and bones crossed my threshold, it sighed in obscene satisfaction. So many years I have waited, gathering strength in this between place, preparing for the glorious hunt. My tongue felt welded to the roof of my mouth. I could only gape in slack-jawed horror as the phantasmic visage literally drank in my terror, its form solidifying, gaining substance from my fear. What are you?" I finally managed to croak. The thing's lipless mouth curved into a vile approximation of a smile. "I am the spirit of this land, ancient and eternal. I am the primal fear that lurks in the hearts of all prey. I am the shadow cast by the moon, the mist that clings to the bogs, the wraith that stalks the night. And you, dear children, are my sacrificial lambs." Through the fog of my stupefaction, I dimly registered that the assault on the cabin walls had ceased. An awful intuition rose in my mind. The beasts had only been driving us here all along, into the lair of their master. Why us? Ryan's strangled whisper mirrored my own dazed incomprehension. What do you want? Because you were foolish enough to trespass in my domain. Because your blind arrogance amuses me. Because your pain and fear is sweet nectar to my lips. The nightmarish entity drifted closer, its tattered shroud of shadows undulating hungrily. As for what I want to savor your despair as I flay your minds, to feel your sanity unravel as I peel it apart, layer by layer, to feed on your life force until nothing remains but gibbering husks. Bile rose in my throat. An eternity of torment, of having our very essences devoured and corrupted, seemed a fate infinitely worse than a quick death under rending claws. And in that moment of blackest revelation, I knew with numb certainty it had all been inevitable from the moment we set foot in these cursed woods, that it wasn't poor decisions or random chance that had brought us to this fate. The spirit of this place had orchestrated every step of our doom in an intricate and malevolent dance as foreordained as the phases of the moon. Fight or flight instinct still screamed at me to run, to try for the door, but my muscles refused to obey. I was a hare frozen beneath the gaze of a cobra, unwilling mesmerism rooting me to the spot. Helpless tears tracked down my cheeks as I contemplated an existence more hellish than I could ever conceive. But then, through the haze of my despair, I noticed something. The runes etched into the fireplace, the very symbols that seemed to grant the wraith its power, had begun to flicker and dim. The more the malevolent spirit manifested, the more energy it expended, the weaker their eldritch light grew, as if its presence here, on this side of the void, was only made possible by the mystical conduit they provided, and without that anchor, that foothold. A desperate idea kindled in my mind then, born of the absolute certainty that if I did nothing, we would suffer a fate more horrific than death. With my last ounce of defiance, I lunged for the dwindling embers of our fire and snatched up a half-charred log, ignoring the flash of pain as it seared my hands. The wraith let loose a hiss of outrage, its form billowing violently. "Impudent child, you dare!" But there was a shrill edge to its fury, a tinge of what almost sounded like fear. Before it could fully react, I swung the log with all my might at the fireplace, directly at the heart of the pulsing ward runes. The impact shattered the weakened stone, sending shards exploding outward. Instantly, the purple light surged, writhing across the masonry as if in mortal agony. A piercing shriek rattled the window panes. I struck again and again, chipping away at the sigils, even as the wraith howled and clawed at my face with talons of shadow. White-hot pain lanced through my head, 1,000 nightmarish visions threatening to pull me under. But I clung to consciousness like a drowning man, flailing blindly in a haze of flying soot and rock dust. Then, with a final crunch, the last rune guttered out like a candle flame snuffed by an unseen breath. The wraith's cry rose to an ear-splitting crescendo, its form shredding apart at the edges as it wailed its thwarted malice. The unnatural wind whipping through the cabin reached gale force, slamming me backwards into the wall. Dimly, over the eldritch maelstrom, I heard Jack and Ryan shouting, calling my name. Then, as abruptly as it began, the chaos ceased. An unnatural silence descended, so deep and still that for a harrowing moment I thought I had gone deaf. But then I heard it, the slow, welcome creaks and groans of a normal forest at night. The oppressive atmosphere of dread and doom was simply gone, vanished along with the wraith and its sigil-spun prison. Shaking, drained, but alive, I hauled myself painfully to my feet amid the ruins and embraced my ashen-faced friends. We had survived an unreality more terrifying than any sane mind could comprehend. But our ordeal wasn't quite finished. We still had to escape these shadow-haunted woods and carry word of what transpired to the outside world, in solemn memory of those we had lost. The journey back to the trailhead was a stumbling, nightmarish ordeal that I recall only in the haziest of fragments. Miles that felt like lifetimes, jumping at every snapping twig, clinging to the faintest hint of dawn on the horizon like a talisman against the horrors of the night. Every time I blinked, I saw the after-image of the wraith's baleful visage, or flashes of the grisly fates of Mike and Chris. Somehow, eventually, we staggered back to Chris's waiting car, falling into an exhausted silence as we sped back toward the nearest vestige of civilization. The same unspoken question hung over us like a pall. How could we possibly find the words to convey the full depths of the nightmare we had endured and still preserve our tenuous hold on sanity? Who would believe us? In the end, I'm still not sure what I believe. If the whole experience was some shared delusion born of isolation and primal paranoia, or if we really had become pawns in a hunt as old as fear itself, orchestrated by a malign intelligence beyond the scope of the rational. I only know that not a single night has passed since that I don't bolt awake in a cold sweat, the ragged screams of the dying echoing in my ears, desperate to assure myself that the glint of purple light in the darkness is just a trick of an overstrung mind. But when the wind rattles the panes and the branches scratch at the window like claws, and the moon rides high and baleful in a starless sky, doubt gnaws at me with an icy dread. Because the one thing I know with crystalline certainty is that places like those we dared tread exist, primeval pockets of land that have never known the taming touch of human civilization. And in those shadowed, silent reaches, things older than time itself hold sway, as patient and pitiless as the turning of the seasons. So I leave this account as a warning and a reminder. To any who find their hubris and curiosity drawing them to test themselves against the denizens of the wild, look elsewhere for your trials of courage. For there are some places man was never meant to walk, some mysteries that should remain buried beneath the dead leaves and loam. Because in the deepest, darkest depths of the forest, the only rule is that of fang and claw. And if you stray from the light, you may discover that you are not the hunter after all, but the prey. The days and weeks following our escape from the forest were a blur of police interviews, fruitless searches, and the agonizing task of breaking the news to Mike and Chris's devastated families. At first, we tried to tell the truth, to describe the nightmarish entities that had hunted us and the arcane horrors that haunted that forest. But the skepticism and incredulity in the eyes of the authorities quickly made it clear that revealing the full extent of what we had witnessed would only damage our credibility and likely our perceived sanity. So, as much as it pained me, we amended our story. We claimed that Mike and Chris had been attacked by unusually large and vicious bears, their bodies dragged off into the woods. It was still a difficult narrative to swallow given the lack of any remains, but far more plausible than the eldritch truth. Perhaps that's why, despite multiple intensive searches, no trace of our friends was ever found, as if the forest itself had swallowed all evidence that they had ever existed. When the authorities called off the official rescue efforts after a week, I couldn't even summon much surprise. Some bitter, intuitive part of me knew we would never see Mike or Chris again, in this life or any other. In a way, not having the finality of recovered bodies made the grieving process even more excruciating. Their families vacillated between despairing acceptance and raging denial, demanding answers we couldn't provide. Jack, Ryan, and I drifted apart under the weight of our shared trauma, each grappling with the impossible memories in our own way. I threw myself into researching the history and folklore of those woods, desperate to find some context for what had happened to us. Late into the night, I pored over obscure texts and websites, learning far more than I ever wanted to know about the shadowy corners of the world where myth and reality intersect. I discovered that the area had been shunned by indigenous tribes for generations before European settlers ever arrived, that it was known in certain circles as a thin place, where the veil between our world and far darker realms was said to wear precariously thin, that ours were far from the first disappearances to plague that forest, a string of vanishings and grisly deaths stretching back decades, if not centuries. The more I learned, the more I began to suspect our ordeal had been part of a cycle of sacrifice and horror, as old as the land itself, that the wraith-like entity orchestrating the hunt from its decaying cabin was a shred of some ancient, primal evil, a malign intelligence woven into the very fabric of those shadow-haunted woods. Perhaps it fed on fear and suffering the way we feed on bread and water, needing periodic sacrifices to sate its unnatural hunger. Our intrusion into its domain had simply marked us as the most convenient prey, the easiest flesh to rend and bones to snap. These dark epiphanies brought me no peace, no closure. If anything, they only amplified the sense of cosmic helplessness, that we were but insignificant fleas caught in a web of eldritch forces beyond our comprehension. That the mundane world we clung to was a fragile illusion, a soap bubble begging to be popped by the claws lurking in the void. I might have lost myself entirely in that abyss of existential despair were it not for a phone call from Ryan on a bleak November evening, 6 months after we had escaped the forest. His voice was tight with barely suppressed excitement as he urged me to come over to his place immediately. He had something to show me, something that couldn't wait. Intrigued despite myself, I made the drive across town to his small apartment. He greeted me at the door with bloodshot eyes and a manic energy I had never seen from him before. "I found it," he kept muttering as he led me to his kitchen table. "I finally found it." Spread across the scratched formica was a mess of ancient-looking books and maps, most of them marked with the distinctive wear and must-have-used bookstores. But what immediately seized my attention was the sketch lying on top of the pile. A sketch of a symbol I had prayed to never see again. With a shaking finger, Ryan tapped the eldritch runes scrawled in faded ink. It was identical to the ones that had been etched in the hearth of that nightmarish cabin, the ones that had seemed to grant the wraith its power, the ones I had destroyed to banish it back into the abyss. Seeing it again sent a lance of ice down my spine. "I found it in this old book of regional folklore," Ryan explained, his words tumbling out in a caffeinated rush. "It's a warding sigil, a symbol used to bind and confine primal entities to certain places. The indigenous shamans would carve them to trap dark spirits they couldn't destroy outright." I leaned closer, studying the dense paragraphs of cramped text surrounding the sketch. "So those markings in the cabin, they were like a magical prison, keeping that thing locked in those woods?" Ryan nodded vigorously. "Exactly. But here's the important part." He stabbed a finger at a particular passage. "The wards have to be periodically renewed with blood sacrifice. The more powerful the entity, the more frequent the sacrifices need to be. If the rituals are abandoned." He didn't need to finish the thought. A chill of understanding shivered through me. The wraith had said it had been gathering strength, waiting in that in-between place for its glorious hunt. What if our destruction of the wards hadn't just banished it, but freed it entirely, to carry its insatiable hunger for fear to other hunting grounds? Ryan must have read the dawning horror on my face. He looked at me with grim urgency in his eyes, a man who had stared into the same abyss of unthinkable possibilities. "If I'm interpreting this right," he said hoarsely, "then by breaking those sigils, we didn't bind that thing. We released it. And without the shamans to repair the wards and renew the rituals, there's nothing to stop it from spreading." The words fell like tombstones, heavy with unspeakable implications. In our desperation to survive, had we unleashed something far worse on the world? Was our ordeal in the forest merely the prelude to a wider web of nightmares? "We have to do something," Ryan continued. "Try to find a way to contain it again, or warn people, or I don't know. But we can't just ignore this. We've seen what it's capable of." I couldn't hold back a bark of bleak laughter. "Warn them about what? A formless terror from beyond the veil of reality that hunts through fear itself? We'll sound like madmen. They'll lock us away." Tears of frustration welled in Ryan's bloodshot eyes. "I know how it sounds, but I can't just sit here knowing what I know, seeing those symbols every time I close my eyes. We're responsible for this, even if we never meant to be." The desperate urgency in his voice resonated with the guilt gnawing at my own soul. As much as I wanted to deny it, I knew he was right. In this fallen world of horrors and wonders, we alone understood the nature of the threat unbound. The burden fell on us to try to find a way to contain it before it could sink its ethereal claws into more innocent lives. "Okay," I said at last, a leaden resignation settling over me. "We'll do what we can, for Mike and Chris if nothing else. But we need to be smart about it. Careful. We're flying blind here, and I'm not eager to become that thing's quarry again." And so began a quest, as desperate as it was quixotic. Powered by grief, guilt, and grim resolve, Ryan and I spent countless sleepless nights huddled over arcane tomes and obscure websites, trying to unravel the keys to the rituals of binding. We tracked down every whisper of unnatural encounters and paranormal events, trying to map the wraith's movements through the web of fear it spun. Were we hunting it, or was it simply luring us deeper into its labyrinth of shadows, drawing us into a new snare, a more expansive trap? I couldn't shake the skin-crawling intuition that every step we took was playing into some eldritch agenda we couldn't begin to fathom. But what other choice did we have? To bury our heads in the sand and wait for the malign ripples to spread, knowing the next pale faces on the missing posters could be our own doing? To wait for it to accrue enough power to fully manifest in our reality, to turn the whole world into its hunting ground? No, we had to try. For Mike and Chris. For the shamans who had given their blood and sanity to keep it bound. For all the future victims whose suffering might be laid at our feet if we did nothing. Maybe there was no containing such a primal force in the end. Maybe we were deluding ourselves to think two broken men could stand against the onslaught of an entity as old as fear. But if our time in those woods had taught us anything, it was that the only thing more unforgivable than standing against the abyss was surrendering to it. So we soldiered on, through the infested tunnels of the occult and the bleak pits of our own trauma, clinging to each other and to our battered shreds of sanity, a pair of hunters seeking to turn the tables on the ultimate predator. But always, always, in the darkest pits of night, I couldn't escape the insidious fear that it was hunting us in turn, that our every effort to bind it was leading us deeper into its eternally patient snare, that in the end, all our desperate struggles would be little more than the last futile thrashings of the prey before the inexorable snap of shadowed jaws. But what else is left in this fallen world than to rage against the dying of the light, to spit our defiance into the void, even as it swallows us whole? We had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had stared back, and in that eldritch gaze, we had no choice but to see the hunt through to its bitter end, or to become the ones hunted for the rest of our days. In our desperate quest to contain the primal evil unleashed from the forest, Ryan and I soon learned that the true nature of the hunting ground had shifted drastically. The wraith's ethereal influence was no longer confined to those shadow-haunted woods. Tendrils of its fear-fed power had begun to seep into the very fabric of civilization, an invisible miasma coiling unseen through city streets and suburban cul-de-sacs. We first caught wind of its spread through a string of bizarre and unsettling incidents cropping up in the news. A rash of missing persons cases, all of them vanishing without a trace after raving to loved ones about being stalked by unseen predators. Accounts of strange mists creeping through public parks, leaving behind the mutilated carcasses of animals. And sometimes, the odd blood-stained scrap of human clothing. An entire downtown block whose residents descended into a shared psychosis overnight, barricading themselves inside while screaming about the horrors clawing at their walls. To the general public and the authorities, these were unconnected tragedies, freak occurrences, and sad footnotes in the police blotter. But to those of us who had survived a glimpse behind the curtain, who knew to look for the pattern amid the static of strange events, the grim implications were all too clear. The wraith was insinuating itself into the cracks in the facade of the mundane, exploiting the fear and isolation that lurked in every human heart. Where once it had to lure prey into its forest domain to feed, now it could stalk and harvest us in our own backyards, glutting itself on a conveyor belt of terror. And with every atrocity it orchestrated, every nightmare it wove into the collective unconscious, it was only growing stronger, its presence seeping ever deeper into the marrow of our world. How long until that spectral invasion reached a tipping point? Until our reality was little more than an extension of its eternally hungry shadow? This was the chilling theory that consumed our waking thoughts and haunted our restless nights as Ryan and I hurled ourselves into the task of triangulating the wraith's movements and machinations through the web of human misery it spun. If we could just pinpoint the locus of its power, the nexus from which its malign influence radiated, perhaps we could find a way to blunt its advance, to excise its spoor from our collective psyche before the infection reached the terminal stage. But it was a task easier named than done. After all, how does one track a being that seems to exist more as a poisonous thought form than a physical entity, a creature of mist and fear and nightmare logic? We couldn't exactly punch its lair coordinates into Google Maps and come up with a handy address to stage our desperate exorcism. Instead, we were forced to trawl through the darkest recesses of the paranormal underground, sifting through a morass of rumor, speculation, and apocryphal lore for any scrap of data that might light our way. We pored over musty tomes of forbidden knowledge in university archives, scrolled through endless occult forums and conspiracy theory message boards, even tracked down old stories and oral histories from the indigenous peoples whose ancestors had first learned to fear the forest's eldritch hunger. Piece by piece, through caffeine-fueled bouts of bleary research and manic dot connecting, a pattern began to cohere from the static. Certain locations cropped up again and again in the litany of strange events, coordinates that traced the edges of an emergent shape. Separately, they were just unfortunate places where the veil between worlds seemed to wear thin. A shuttered mental asylum where a string of patient suicides defied explanation. A deconsecrated church where shadows gathered with eerie intent. A bridge notorious for the number of people compelled to leap from its spans. But taken together, plotted out on a map with threads of red yarn, they formed the rough outline of a very familiar symbol, the warding sigil, whose destruction had unleashed the wraith in the first place. It was as if those points were acting as anchors for the entity, allowing it to project itself along the ley lines of fear that connected them to turn the entire region into an extension of its original hunting grounds. With dawning horror, I traced my finger along the lines of the phantom sigil, the edges of a magical trap snapping into focus. There was still one point unaccounted for, one anchor required to complete the pattern and fully manifest the wraith's power in our world. And in a flash of grim certainty, I knew exactly where that final locus would be. The one place where the borders between realities had first been sundered, where the cycle of sacrifice and nightmare had been interrupted. The one place where we had personally paved the way for its intrusion into our lives. That goddamned cabin. The nexus of our trauma. The site of our first encounter with the piercing abyss of its gaze. Of course the trap would snap shut there, the beast claiming its hunting grounds in full. I turned to Ryan, nausea and adrenaline rising in equal measure at the revelation. His haunted eyes met mine with the same leaden understanding, the same fatalistic acceptance. We both knew there was only one way this could play out, only one path left to us. We had to go back, to return to the source of our sundered innocence and make our stand, for good or ill. It wasn't a question of whether we could win in a world suddenly reordered by the impossible. Against a primal darkness that broke minds and devoured souls, that had turned reality itself into its stalking grounds, we had no illusions of victory. We who had been hunted, and in our struggles to survive had only opened the door to the abyss, could never truly be the hunters. No, for us, it had only ever been a question of how we could make our defeat mean something, what we could salvage from the ruins of our former lives, what we could deny the wraith to the very last. If we could lure it back to that rotting cabin, distract it just long enough to restore the sigils and bind it once more, perhaps we could spare others our fate, dam the widening gyre of its malice. We would be its sacrifice, the blood price required to seal the breach between worlds, a last futile act of defiance, to spit in its eye, even as it consumed us. In a fallen world where meaning had bled out with the color, where the only truth left was the inexorable dread of the stalking shadow. Maybe that was the best we broken hunters could hope for. So we made our preparations in grim silence, each of us reflecting on the little rituals and ablutions of a life we knew would soon be cut short. Phone calls to bewildered family members, telling them we loved them without the context that would make it a goodbye. Emails to old friends, making amends for petty rifts and remembering better days. Visiting the local animal shelter to give some faithful canines one last moment of human kindness and a belly rub for the road. And through it all, the journaling, the constant journaling. Pouring out our story onto every scrap of paper we could find, secreting it in hidden flash drives and remote servers, burying it deep in the archives of the occult underground. Because if we couldn't make it out with our lives, then maybe we could with our warning, our hard-won scraps of impossible truth. Maybe someday, someone would stumble across our testaments and piece together the clues we had left behind, would see through the cracks in the world to the deeper darkness lurking beneath and find a way to renew the rituals, to take up the vigil we had been forced to abandon. It was a slim hope, a desperate lifeline cast into an uncertain future. But it was all we had left to cling to. And so, with our affairs settled and our resolve hardened to a nihilistic edge, we gathered our warding supplies and our weapons, our canned food and our candles, and set off one last time for the forest that had claimed us, the place where our lives had first become a waking nightmare. Back to that hungry hollow, that gaping maw in the skin of the world, to make our last stand in the physical epicenter of its power. Back to that decaying cabin squatting like an obscene altar amid the creeping murk. Back to the belly of the beast. To meet our stalker, our destroyer, our dark twin. To become the sacrifice required to bind it, or to die spitting our last defiance into the void that gaped beneath its gaze. Back to the primal hunting ground, one last hunt to end all hunts, where the only uncertainty that remained was which of us would be the hunters, and which the hunted. But then, in a world gone mad, in a reality reordered by tooth and claw and the stalking shadow, did that distinction even matter anymore? All that was left was the chase, the pounding heart, the blood-copper taste of terror. All that was left was the hunt. Our return to the forest where it had all begun was an exercise in grim déjà vu, a macabre reprisal of a journey we had taken in innocence and exited in nightmare. The same winding roads, the same weedy pull-off, the same overgrown trailhead that seemed to breathe with ominous intent. But if the physical geography was familiar, the psychic terrain we navigated was another matter entirely. Gone was the nervous camaraderie, the naive excitement of friends embarking on an adventure. In its place was a grim, haunted silence, the palpable dread of two men walking knowingly to their own execution. Every step we took was an act of will, a denial of the instinct to flee and never look back. As we hiked deeper into the gloom of the forest, the signs of the wraith's growing power soon became apparent. Scorch marks and eldritch sigils marred the bark of the trees, pulsing with that nauseating purple light. Shadows gathered with new intensity, their edges shimmering and reforming in ways that defied natural geometry. And always, that sense of being watched, of being marked by a predator's gaze, a pressure that grew into a physical ache behind the eyes. We moved through that aura of menace, like divers descending into the crushing black of an oceanic trench, every fiber of our being screaming at us to turn back. But grimly, stubbornly, we pressed onwards to our goal. That dilapidated cabin crouching in a hollow like a ravenous beast, its rotting maw agape. Our plan, if it could be called that, was a study in desperation. We would use our own fear, our own trauma, as bait for the wraith, a beacon of psychic anguish to draw it to us. Once it took that bait, once it manifested in a form we could grapple with, we would distract it just long enough to reconstruct the warding sigils on the cabin's hearth. Seal it back in its decaying prison through the spilling of our own blood, the severing of the connection forged by its claws. A plan that demanded our suffering, that traded on our brokenness. A plan that required us to run headlong into the primal terror we had spent the last year running from. But then, that had always been the devil's bargain, hadn't it? To use the wraith's own weapons against it, to embrace the monstrousness it had awoken within us. We had no illusions of noble sacrifice, of a storybook ending. We who had set it free through our own heedless destruction could never play the spotless heroes. No, we were doing this for purely selfish reasons, to silence the screaming in our own minds, to cauterize the claw wounds on our souls, to have some agency in an end we knew was inescapable. And if, by some unlikely grace, we managed to bind the thing again, to spare others our fate, so be it. But that was secondary to the true goal, unspoken, but bone-certain, to face the beast on our own terms, to meet its annihilating gaze with one last defiant howl, to be the sacrifice instead of the sacrificed. With those thoughts, at once grandiose and unbearably bleak, we approached the black mouth of the cabin. The air around it shimmered like a heat haze. The veil between worlds stretched to a moaning thinness. I could feel the wraith's presence like a physical pressure, a smothering psychic weight bearing down on us. It knew we were here. It had been waiting. "No turning back now," Ryan said, his voice a dry rasp. He clutched the ritual knife in a white-knuckled grip, his other hand shaking around the can of spray paint we would use to reconstruct the sigils. Into the belly of the beast. I nodded grimly, my own fear a live current under my skin. Let's finish this, one way or another. Together, moving as one, we stepped across the threshold and into the Stygian depths of the cabin. Into the nightmare that had been waiting, patient zero of an infection that had contaminated the world. Into the gaping maw of a reality reordered by shadows. What happened in that lightless lair is a fever dream, a delirium of impressions more than a coherent narrative. Flashlight beams scything through a cloying murk, the skitter of claws on rotting wood, a stench like carrion and despair. The cabin writhing around us, unfolding like some obscene origami, as if we had stepped into the flexing organs of a vast and ancient beast. And there, in the charred ruin of the hearth, a swirling vortex of absolute darkness, a hole in the world that pulsed like an infected wound. The wraith uncoiling itself from that lightless pit, a shape of empty shadow and malevolent flame, of antlers and embers and teeth, every nightmare made manifest, every childhood terror given form and awful purpose. We screamed then, the full-throated howls of the damned, our voices twining with the wraith's triumphant roar, a dissonant choir of agony and ecstasy. We charged, weapons raised, hurling our bodies and our sanity against the unassailable dark. To say we fought would be too grandiose. There was no heroic battle, no skillful dance of thrust and riposte. Only flailing, shrieking desperation. Only the spastic death throes of prey cornered by a vastly superior predator. The wraith toyed with us, batted us aside with contemptuous ease, its laughter a serrated blade across the mind. We were insects before a hurricane, sparrows before a wolf. Yet somehow, through luck or fate or sheer stubborn grit, we managed to hold its attention just long enough. Long enough for Ryan, broken and bleeding, to crawl to the hearth and begin spraying wavering sigils through his tears. Long enough for me to slice open my own palm and smear my blood on those eldritch marks in unholy communion. The wraith, realizing our intent, howled in fury. A force like a sledgehammer slammed into my chest, flinging me across the room to crumple against the wall. Through the gray haze of agony, I watched Ryan work, teeth gritted, hand shaking as he connected the lines of our salvation and our damnation. He was chanting now, ancient words torn from a blackened throat. The wording runes began to glow, fitfully at first, then with a steadier pulse. The wraith screeched and thrashed, its form distorting, fraying at the edges. Shadows lashed the walls, clawing for escape, finding only the unyielding geometry of the sigils. The energies they channeled lanced through the cabin, a building pressure, a trap snapping inexorably shut. In that eternal splintered moment, my eyes met the wraiths across the maelstrom. Sentient darkness and flickering flame, pitiless depths that pulled at the soul. A gaze that knew me, that saw all the fault lines and hollow places in my being, every secret flinch and festering guilt. It was my annihilation, my apotheosis, the event horizon of my sanity. I saw, in that timeless moment, the truth of our symbiosis, our awful communion, that without our fear, it would starve, that its existence depended on our belief, our imagination, that in the end, the only thing that could nourish a god of terror was our own terror. And in that understanding was a strange, bitter species of peace. For if we, in our brokenness, were the authors of its power, we could also be the agents of its binding. We were writing the terms of our own salvation, authoring our own deliverance through this ritual of confrontation and catharsis. We couldn't unsee the abyss, unknow the truth of the stalking shadow. But in the crucible of this moment, we could transform our trauma, our damage, into the bars of a cage. We could make our nightmare the warden of our sanity, the jailer of our monster. That was the secret, the hidden key. To embrace our fear, to own it, to forge it into a chain for the beast. To make our minds a prison it could never escape, because we would never escape it. To bind it in the only cell strong enough to hold a god, the dungeon of our shattered psyches. And so, in that infinite fractured instant, I poured everything into the connection, the current of battle and nightmare. Every memory of that first hellish night, every hour spent jumping at shadows, every relationship's destroyed by my brittle paranoia. All the ways the Wraith had made me, unmade me, reshaped me. It howled as I fed our bond, glowed with the heat of our history. I was venom and salvation, victory and defeat, the shackle and the shackled. The Wraith's annihilation and its apotheosis, dream and dreamer, monster and mirror. The warding sigils blazed with cold fire, a glacial light. The air shimmered, convulsed with unleashed potential. And then, with a sound like reality tearing, the Wraith, folded in on itself, was pulled shrieking into the vortex of its prison. The cabin shuddered, groaned like a sinking ship, and then fell still. A silence, as deep and still as an open grave, as profound as the space between stars. And Ryan and I, still living, still breathing, knelt in the dust and the ruin. Weeping, laughing, howling to the uncaring dark, the bladder-voiding rush of still being alive overwhelming all else. We had done it, won and lost, saved and damned ourselves, written the final chapter of our story in blood and fire and madness. We crawled out of that black pit on our hands and knees, left it to the forest and the forces we had bound within it, dragged ourselves back to a world we no longer recognized, a reality forever fractured by the cracks of our knowing. In the days and years to come, we would pick up the pieces, stitch them together into a quilt of scar tissue and gallows humor. We would tell our story in fits and fragments, in carefully anonymized screeds on occult message boards and whispered confessions in shadowed bars. We would learn to live with the knotted thing behind our hearts, to use it as a hidden compass. We would be the watchers on the wall, the guardians of thresholds and tellers of bleak truths. We would forever ring the edges of the abyss, marked by it, part of it, wardens of the unquiet dark. The Wraith was not dead, not gone, only dreaming in the cage of our minds, the prison of our devotion. We could feel it there, coiled and waiting, a slumbering viper in the deep places of our souls. One day we knew the sigils would fade, the bars would bend, the beast would wake. But until then, we would hold the line. Stand our watch on the borderlands of a world that would never know how close it had come to the final nightfall. We would laugh and drink and love, tell our tales to any who would listen, the secret keepers, the shepherds of the black. And when the stars were right, when the abyss yawned wide, we would be there to meet it. Broken and damned, bound by blood and darkness. Hunters and hunted, saviors and sacrifices. We had written our own legend, etched it in nightmares and scar tissue. We had discovered the truth of the stalking shadow, the price and power of the primal dark. We had become, God's help us, the keepers of the hunger that waits.